Chapter 1 of The Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 1 The Stark Munro Letters by J. Stark Munro. Being a series of 12 letters written by J. Stark Munro, M.B., to his friend and former fellow-student, Herbert Swanborough, of Lowell, Massachusetts, during the years 1881 to 1884. Edited and arranged by A. Conan Doyle. The letters of my friend Mr. Stark Munro appear to me to form so connected a whole, and to give so plain an account of some of the troubles which a young man may be called upon to face right away at the outset of his career, that I have handed them over to the gentleman who is about to edit them. There are two of them, the 5th and the 9th, from which some excisions are necessary, but in the main I hope that they may be reproduced as they stand. I am sure that there is no privilege which my friend would value more highly than the thought that some other young man, harassed by the needs of this world and doubts of the next, should have gotten strength by reading how a brother had passed down the valley of shadow before him. Herbert Swanborough, Lowell, Massachusetts. The Stark Munro Letters. 1. Home, 30th March, 1881. I have missed you very much since your return to America, my dear Bertie, for you are the one man upon this earth to whom I have ever been able to unreservedly open my whole mind. I don't know why it is, for, now that I come to think of it, I have never enjoyed very much of your confidence in return. But that may be my fault. Perhaps you don't find me sympathetic, even though I have every wish to be. I can only say that I find you intensely so, and perhaps I presume too much upon the fact. But no, every instinct in my nature tells me that I don't bore you by my confidences. Can you remember Cullingworth at the university? You never were in the athletic set, so it is possible that you don't. Anyway, I'll take it for granted that you don't, and explain it all from the beginning. I am sure that you would know his photograph, however, for the reason that he was the ugliest and queerest-looking man of our year. Physically he was a fine athlete, one of the fastest and most determined Rugby forwards that I have ever known, though he played so savage a game that he was never given his international cap. He was well grown, 5'9" perhaps, with square shoulders, an arching chest, and a quick, jerky way of walking. He had a round, strong head, bristling with short, wiry black hair. His face was wonderfully ugly, but it was the ugliness of character which is as attractive as beauty. His jaw and eyebrows were scraggy and rough-hewn, his nose aggressive and red-shot, his eyes small and near-set, light blue in color, and capable of assuming a very genial and also an exceedingly vindictive expression. A slight wiry moustache covered his upper lip, and his teeth were yellow, strong, and overlapping. Add to this that he seldom wore collar or necktie, that his throat was the color and texture of the bark of a Scottish fir, and that he had a voice and especially a laugh like a bull's bellow, and you have some idea, if you can piece all these items in your mind, of the outward James Cullingworth. But the inner man, after all, was what was most worth noting. I don't pretend to know what genius is. Carlyle's definition always seemed to me to be a very crisp and clear statement of what it is not. Far from its being an infinitive capacity for taking pains, its leading characteristic, as far as I have ever been able to observe it, has been that it allows the possessor of it to attain results by a sort of instinct which other men could only reach by hard work. In this sense, Cullingworth was the greatest genius that I have ever known. He never seemed to work, and yet he took the anatomy prize over the heads of all the 10-hour-a-day men. That might not count for much, for he was quite capable of idling ostentatiously all day and then reading desperately all night. But start a subject of your own for him, and then see his originality and strength. Talk about torpedoes, and he would catch up a pencil, and on the back of an old envelope from his pocket he would sketch out some novel contrivance for piercing a ship's netting and getting at her side, which might no doubt involve some technical impossibility, but which would at least be quite plausible and new. Then as he drew, his bristling eyebrows would contract, his small eyes would gleam with excitement, his lips would be pressed together, and he would end by banging on the paper with his own hand, and shouting in his exultation. You would think that his one mission in life was to invent torpedoes. But next instant, if you were to express surprise as to how it was that the Egyptian workmen elevated the stones to the top of the pyramids, out would come the pencil and envelope, and he would propound a scheme for doing that with equal energy and conviction. This ingenuity was joined to an extremely sanguine nature. As he paced up and down in his jerky, quick-stepping fashion after one of these flights of invention, he would take out patents for it, receive you as his partner in the enterprise, have it adopted in every civilized country, see all conceivable applications of it, count up his probable royalties, sketch out the novel methods in which he would invest his gains, and finally retire with the most gigantic fortune that has ever been amassed. And you would be swept along by his words, and would be carried every foot of the way with him, so that it would come as quite a shock to you when you suddenly fell back to earth again, and found yourself trudging the city street a poor student, with Kirk's Physiology under your arm, and hardly the price of your luncheon in your pocket. I read over what I have written, but I can see that I give you no real insight into the demoniac cleverness of Cullingworth. His views upon medicine were most revolutionary, but I dare say that if things fulfil their promise, I may have a good deal to say about them in the sequel. With his brilliant and unusual gifts, his fine athletic record, his strange way of dressing, his hat on the back of his head and his throat bare, his thundering voice, and his ugly, powerful face, he had quite the most marked individuality of any man that I have ever known. Now, you will think me rather prolix about this man, but, as it looks as if his life might become entwined with mine, it is a subject of immediate interest to me, and I am writing all this for the purpose of reviving my own half-jaded impressions, as well as in the hope of amusing and interesting you. So I must give you one or two other points which may make his character more clear to you. He had a dash of the heroic in him. On one occasion he was placed in such a position that he must choose between compromising a lady or springing out of a third-floor window. Without a moment's hesitation he hurled himself out of the window. As luck would have it, he fell through a large laurel bush onto a garden plot, which was soft with rain, and so escaped with a shaking and a bruising. If I have to say anything that gives a bad impression of the man, put that upon the other side. He was fond of rough horseplay, but it was better to avoid it with him, for you could never tell what it might lead to. His temper was nothing less than infernal. I have seen him in the dissecting rooms begin to skylark with a fellow, and then in an instant the fun would go out of his face, his little eyes would gleam with fury, and the two would be rolling, worrying each other like dogs, below the table. He would be dragged off, panting and speechless with fury, with his wiry hair bristling straight up like a fighting terrier's. This pugnacious side of his character would be worthily used sometimes. I remember that an address which was being given to us by an eminent London specialist was much interpreted by a man in the front row, who amused himself by interjecting remarks. The lecturer appealed to his audience at last. "These interruptions are insufferable, gentlemen," said he. "Will no one free me from this annoyance?" "Hold your tongue, you, sir, on the front bench!" cried Cullingworth, in his bull's bellow. "Perhaps you'll make me," said the fellow, turning a contemptuous face over his shoulder. Cullingworth closed his notebook and began to walk down on the tops of the desks, to the delight of the 300 spectators. It was fine to see the deliberate way in which he picked his way among the ink bottles. As he sprang down from the last bench onto the floor, his opponent struck him a smashing blow full in the face. Cullingworth got his bulldog grip on him, however, and rushed him backwards out of the classroom. What he did with him I don't know, but there was a noise like the delivery of a ton of coals, and the champion of law and order returned, with the sedate air of a man who had done his work. One of his eyes looked like an overripe damson, but we gave him 3 cheers as he made his way back to his seat. Then we went on with the dangers of placenta previa. He was not a man who drank hard, but a little drink would have a very great effect upon him. Then it was that the ideas would surge from his brain, each more fantastic and ingenious than the last. And if he ever did get beyond the borderland, he would do the most amazing things. Sometimes it was the fighting instinct that would possess him, sometimes the preaching, and sometimes the comic, or they might come in succession, replacing each other so rapidly as to bewilder his companions. Intoxication brought all kinds of queer little peculiarities with it. One of them was that he could walk or run perfectly straight, but that there always came a time when he unconsciously returned upon his tracks and retraced his steps again. This had a strange effect sometimes, as in the instance which I am about to tell you. Very sober to outward seeming, but in a frenzy within, he went down to the station one night, and, stooping to the pigeon-hole, he asked the ticket clerk, in the suavest voice, whether he could tell him how far it was to London. The official put forward his face to reply, when Cullingworth drove his fist through the little hole with the force of a piston. The clerk flew backwards off his stool, and his yell of pain and indignation brought some police and railway men to his assistance. They pursued Cullingworth, but he, as active and as fit as a greyhound, outraced them all, and vanished into the darkness, down the long straight street. The pursuers had stopped, and were gathered in a knot talking the matter over, when, looking up, they saw, to their amazement, the man whom they were after, running at the top of his speed in their direction. His little peculiarity had asserted itself, you see, and he had unconsciously turned in his flight. They tripped him up, flung themselves upon him, and after a long and desperate struggle dragged him to the police station. He was charged before the magistrate next morning, but made such a brilliant speech from the dock in his own defence that he carried the court with him, and escaped with a nominal fine. At his invitation, the witnesses and the police trooped after him to the nearest hotel, and the affair ended in universal whiskey and sodas. Well now, if, after all these illustrations, I have failed to give you some notion of the man, able, magnetic, unscrupulous, interesting, many-sided, I must despair of ever doing so. I'll suppose, however, that I have not failed, and I will proceed to tell you, my most patient of confidants, something of my personal relations with Cullingworth. When I first made a casual acquaintance with him he was a bachelor. At the end of a long vacation, however, he met me in the street, and told me, in his loud-voiced, volcanic, shoulder-slapping way, that he had just been married. At his invitation, I went up with him then and there to see his wife, and as we walked he told me the history of his wedding, which was as extraordinary as everything else he did. I won't tell it to you here, my dear Bertie, for I feel that I have dived down too many side streets already. But it was a most bustling business, in which the locking of a governess into her room and the dyeing of Cullingworth's hair played prominent parts. Apropos of the latter, he was never quite able to get rid of its traces, and from this time forward there was added to his other peculiarities the fact that when the sunlight struck upon his hair at certain angles, it turned it all iridescent and shimmering. Well, I went up to his lodgings with him, and was introduced to Mrs. Cullingworth. She was a timid, little, sweet-faced, grey-eyed woman, quiet-voiced and gentle-mannered. You had only to see the way in which she looked at him to understand that she was absolutely under his control, and that do what he might, or say what he might, he would always be the best thing to her. She could be obstinate, too, in a gentle way, dove-like sort of way, but her obstinacy lay always in the direction of backing up his sayings and doings. This, however, I was only to find out afterwards, and at that, my first visit, she impressed me as being one of the sweetest little women that I had ever known. They were living in the most singular style, in a suite of 4 small rooms over a grocer's shop. There was a kitchen, a sitting room, and a 4th room, which Cullingworth insisted upon regarding as a most unhealthy apartment and a focus of disease, though I am convinced that it was nothing more than the smell of cheeses from below which had given him the idea. At any rate, with his usual energy, he had not only locked the room up, but had gummed varnished paper over all the cracks of the door, to prevent the imaginary contagion from spreading. The furniture was the sparest possible. There were, I remember, only 2 chairs in the sitting room, so that when a guest came, and I think I was the only one, Cullingworth used to squat upon a pile of yearly volumes of the British Medical Journal in the corner. I can see him now levering himself up from his lowly seat, and striding about the room, roaring and striking with his hands, while his little wife sat mum in the corner, listening to him with love and admiration in her eyes. What did we care, any one of the 3 of us, where we sat or how we lived, when youth throbbed hot in our veins, and our souls were all aflame with the possibilities of life? I still look upon those Bohemian evenings in the bare room amid the smell of the cheese as being among the happiest that I have known. I was a frequent visitor to the Cullingworths, for the pleasure that I got was made the sweeter by the pleasure which I hoped that I gave. They knew no one, and desired to know no one, so that socially I seemed to be the only link that bound them to the world. I even ventured to interfere in the details of their little menage. Cullingworth had a fad at the time that all the diseases of civilization were due to the abandonment of the open-air life of our ancestors, and as a corollary he kept his windows open day and night. As his wife was obviously fragile, and yet would have died before she would have uttered a word of complaint, I took it upon myself to point out to him that the cough from which she suffered was hardly to be cured so long as she spent her life in a draught. He scowled savagely at me for my interference, and I thought we were on the verge of a quarrel. But it blew over, and he became more considerate in the matter of ventilation. Our evening occupations just about that time were of a most extraordinary character. You are aware that there is a substance, called waxy matter, which is deposited in the tissues of the body during the course of certain diseases. What this may be, and how it is formed, has been a cause for much bickering among pathologists. Cullingworth had strong views upon the subject, holding that the waxy matter was really the same thing as the glycogen which is normally secreted by the liver. But it is one thing to have an idea, and another to be able to prove it. Above all, we wanted some waxy matter with which to experiment. But fortune favored us in the most magical way. The professor of pathology had come into possession of a magnificent specimen of the condition. With pride he exhibited the organ to us in the classroom, before ordering his assistant to remove it to the ice chest, preparatory to its being used for microscopical work in the practical class. Cullingworth saw his chance, and acted on the instant. Slipping out of the classroom, he threw open the ice chest, and rolled his ulster round the dreadful glistening mass, closed the chest again, and walked quietly away. I have no doubt that to this day the disappearance of that waxy liver is one of the most inexplicable mysteries in the career of our professor. That evening, and for many evenings to come, we worked upon our liver. For our experiments it was necessary to subject it all to great heat in an endeavor to separate the nitrogenous cellular substance from the non-nitrogenous waxy matter. With our limited appliances, the only way we could think of was to cut it into fine pieces and cook it in a frying pan. So night after night the curious spectacle might have been seen of a beautiful young woman and 2 very earnest young men busily engaged in making these grim fricassees. Nothing came of all our work, for though Cullingworth considered that he had absolutely established his case, and wrote long screeds to the medical papers upon the subject, he was never apt at stating his views with his pen, and he left, I am sure, a very confused idea on the minds of his readers as to what it was that he was driving at. Again, as he was a mere student without any letters after his name, he got scant attention, and I never heard that he gained over a single supporter. At the end of the year we both passed our examinations and became duly qualified medical men. The Cullingworths vanished away, and I never heard any more of them, for he was a man who prided himself upon never writing a letter. His father had formerly a very large and lucrative practice in the west of Scotland, but he died some years ago. I had a vague idea, founded upon some chance remark of his, that Cullingworth had gone to see whether the family name might still stand him in good stead there. As for me, I began, as you will remember that I explained in my last, by acting as assistant in my father's practice. You know, however, that at its best it is not worth more than £700 a year, with no room for expansion. This is not large enough to keep two of us at work. Then again, there are times when I can see that my religious opinions annoy the dear old man. On the whole, and for every reason, I think that it would be better if I were out of this. I applied for several steamship lines, and for at least a dozen house surgeonships, but there is as much competition for a miserable post with 100 a year as if it were the viceroyship of India. As a rule, I simply got my testimonials returned without any comment, which is the sort of thing that teaches a man humility. Of course it is very pleasant to live with the matter, and my little brother Paul is a regular trump. I am teaching him boxing, and you should see him put his tiny fists up, and counter with his right. He got me under the jaw this evening, and I had to ask for poached eggs for supper. And all this brings me up to the present time and the latest news. It is that I had a telegram from Cullingworth this morning, after 9 months' silence. It was dated from Avonmouth, the town where I had suspected that he had settled, and it said simply, "Come at once. I have urgent need of you. Cullingworth." Of course I shall go by the first train to-morrow. It may mean anything or nothing. In my heart of hearts, I hope and believe that old Cullingworth sees an opening for me either as his partner or in some other way. I always believed that he would turn up trumps, and make my fortune as well as his own. He knows that I am not very quick or brilliant. I'm fairly steady and reliable. So that's what I've been working up to all along, Bertie, that to-morrow I go to join Cullingworth, and that it looks as if there was to be an opening for me at last. I gave you a sketch of him and his ways, so that you may take an interest in the development of my fortune, which you could not do if you did not know something of the man who is holding out his hand to me. Yesterday was my birthday, and I was 22 years of age. For 22 years have I swung around the sun, and in all seriousness, without a touch of levity, and from the bottom of my soul, I assure you that I have at the very present moment the very vaguest idea as to whence I have come from, whither I am going, or what I am here for. It is not for want of inquiry or from indifference. I have mastered the principles of several religions. They have all shocked me by the violence which I should have to do to my reason to accept the dogmas of any of them. Their ethics are usually excellent. So are the ethics of the common law of England. But the scheme of creation upon which those ethics are built, well, it really is to me the most astonishing thing that I have seen in my short earthly pilgrimage, that so many able men, deep philosophers, astute lawyers, and clear-headed men of the world should accept such an explanation of the facts of life. In the face of their apparent concurrence, my own poor little opinion would not dare to do more than lurk at the back of my soul, were it not that I take courage when I reflect that the equally eminent lawyers and philosophers of Rome and Greece were all agreed that Jupiter had numerous wives and was fond of a glass of good wine. Mind, my dear Bertie, I do not wish to run down your view or that of any other man. We who claim toleration should be the first to extend it to others. I am only indicating my own position, as I have often done before. And I know your reply so well. Can't I hear your grave voice saying, "Have faith"? Your conscience allows you to. Well, mine won't allow me. I see so clearly that faith is not a virtue, but a vice. It is a goat which has been herded with the sheep. If a man deliberately shut his physical eyes, and refused to use them, You would be as quick as any one in seeing that it was immoral and a treason to nature. And yet you would counsel a man to shut that far more precious gift, the reason, and to refuse to use it in the most intimate question of life. The reason cannot help in such a matter, you reply. I answer that to say so is to give up a battle before it is fought. My reason shall help me, and when it can help no longer, I shall do without help. It's late, Bertie, and the fire's out, and I'm shivering, and you, I'm very sure, are heartily weary of my gossip and my heresies. So adieu until my next. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 2 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 2. Home, 10th of April, 1881. Well, my dear Bertie, here I am again in your post-box. It's not a fortnight since I wrote you that great long letter, and yet you see I have news enough to make another formidable budget. They say that the art of letter-writing has been lost, but if quantity may atone for quality, you must confess that, for your sins, you have a friend who has retained it. When I wrote to you last, I was on the eve of going down to join the Cullingworths at Avonmouth, with every hope that he had found some opening for me. I must tell you at some length the particulars of that expedition. I travelled down part of the way with young Leslie Duncan, whom I think you know. He was gracious enough to consider that a third-class carriage and my company were to be preferred to a first-class with solitude. You know that he came into his uncle's money a little time ago, and after a first delirious outbreak he has now relapsed into that dead-heavy state of despair which is caused by having everything which one can wish for. How absurd are the ambitions of life, when I think that I, who am fairly happy and as keen as a razor-edge, should be struggling for that which I can see has brought neither profit nor happiness to him. And yet, if I can read my own nature, it is not the accumulation of money which is my real aim, but only that I may acquire so much as will relieve my mind of sordid cares and enable me to develop any gifts which I may have, undisturbed. My tastes are so simple that I cannot imagine any advantage which wealth can give, save indeed the exquisite pleasure of helping a good man or a good cause. Why should people ever take credit for charity, when they must know that they cannot gain as much pleasure out of their guineas in any other fashion? I gave my watch to a broken schoolmaster the other day, having no change in my pocket, and the mater could not quite determine whether it was a trait of madness or of nobility. I could have told her with absolute confidence that it was neither the one nor the other, but a sort of Epicurean selfishness with perhaps a little dash of swagger away down at the bottom of it. What had I ever had from my chronometer like the quiet thrill of satisfaction when the fellow brought me the pawn ticket and told me that the 30 shillings had been useful? Leslie Duncan got out at Carstairs, and I was left alone with a hale, white-haired old Roman Catholic priest, who had sat quietly reading his office in the corner. We fell into the most intimate talk, which lasted all the way to Avonmouth. Indeed, so interested was I, that I very nearly passed through the place without knowing it. Father Logan, for that was his name, seemed to me a beautiful type of what a priest should be, self-sacrificing and pure-minded, with a kind of simple cunning about him, and a deal of innocent fun. He had the defects as well as the virtues of his class, for he was absolutely reactionary in his views. We discussed religion with fervour, and his theology was somewhere about the early Pliocene. He might have chattered the matter over with a priest of Charlemagne's court, and they would have shaken hands after every sentence. He would acknowledge this and claim it as a merit. It was consistency in his eyes. If our astronomers and inventors and lawgivers had been equally consistent, where would modern civilization be? Is religion the only domain of thought which is non-progressive and to be referred forever to a standard set 2,000 years ago? Can they not see that as the human brain evolves it must take a wider outlook? A half-formed brain makes a half-formed God, and who shall say that our brains are even half-formed yet? The truly inspired priest is the man or woman with the big brain. It is not the shaven patch on the outside, but it is the 60 ounces within which is the real mark of election. You know that you are turning up your nose at me, Bertie. I can see you do it. But I'll come off the thin ice, and you shall have nothing but facts now. I'm afraid that I should never do for a storyteller, for the first stray character that comes along puts his arms in mine and walks me off, with my poor story straggling away to nothing behind me. Well, then, it was night when we reached Avonmouth, and as I popped my head out of the carriage window, the first thing that my eyes rested upon was old Cullingworth, standing in the circle of light under a gas-lamp. His frock-coat was flying open, his waistcoat unbuttoned at the top, and his hat, a top hat this time, jammed on the back of his head, with his bristling hair spurting out in front of it. In every way, save that he wore a collar, he was the same Cullingworth as ever. He gave a roar of recognition when he saw me, bustled me out of my carriage, seized my carpet-bag, or grip-sack as you used to call it, and a minute later we were striding along together through the streets. I was, as you may imagine, all in a tingle to know what it was that he wanted with me. However, as he made no allusion to it, I did not care to ask, and during our longish walk we talked about indifferent matters. It was football first, I remember, whether Richmond had a chance against Blackheath, and the way in which the new passing game was shredding the old scrimmages. Then he got on to inventions, and became so excited that he had to give me back my bag in order that he might be able to slap all his points home with his fist upon his palm. I can see him now stopping, with his face leaning forward and his yellow tusks gleaming in the lamplight. "My dear Munro," this was the style of the thing, "why was armor abandoned, eh? What? I'll tell you why. It was because the weight of metal that would protect a man who was standing up was more than he could carry. But battles are not fought nowadays by men who are standing up. Your infantry are all lying on their stomachs, and it would take very little to protect them. And steel has improved, Munro. Chilled steel. Bessemer. Very good. How much to cover a man? 14 inches by 12, meeting at an angle so that the bullet will glance. A notch at one side for the rifle. There you have it, laddie. The Cullingworth patent portable bulletproof shield. Weight? Oh, the weight would be 16 pounds. I worked it out. Each company carries its shields in go-karts, and they are served out on going into action. Give me 20,000 good shots, and I'll go in at Calais and come out at Pekin. Think of it, my boy, the moral effect. One side gets home every time the other plasters its bullets up against steel plates. No troops would stand it. The nation that gets it first will pitchfork the rest of Europe over the edge. They're bound to have it, all of them. Let's reckon it out. There's about 8 million of them on a war footing. Let us suppose that only half of them have it. I say only half because I don't want to be too sanguine. That's 4 million, and I should take a royalty of 4 shillings on wholesale orders. What's that, Munro? About 750,000 sterling, eh? How's that, laddie, eh? What? Really, that is not unlike his style of talk, now that I come to read it over, only you miss the queer stops, the sudden confidential whispers, the roar with which he triumphantly answered his own questions, the shrugs and slaps and gesticulations, but not a word all the time as to what it was that made him send me that urgent wire which brought me to Avonmouth. I had, of course, been puzzling in my mind as to whether he had succeeded or not, though from his cheerful appearance and buoyant talk it was tolerably clear to me that all was well with him. I was, however, surprised when, as we walked along a quiet, curving avenue, with great houses standing in their grounds upon either side, he stopped and turned in through the iron gate which led up to one of the finest of them. The moon had broken out, and shone upon the high-peaked roof, and upon the gables at each corner. When he knocked, it was opened by a footman with red plush knee-breeches. I began to perceive that my friend's success must have been something colossal. When we came down to the dining-room for supper, Mrs. Cullingworth was waiting there to greet me. I was sorry to see that she was pale and weary-looking. However, we had a merry meal in the old style, and her husband's animation reflected itself upon her face, until at last we might have been back in the little room where the medical journals served as a chair, instead of in the great oak-furnished, picture-hung chamber to which we had been promoted. All the time, however, not one word as to the object of my journey. When the supper was finished, Cullingworth led the way into a small sitting-room, where we both lit our pipes, and Mrs. Cullingworth her cigarette. He sat for some little time in silence, and then bounding up, rushed to the door and flung it open. It is always one of his strange peculiarities to think that people are eavesdropping or conspiring against him, for in spite of his superficial brusqueness and frankness, a strange vein of superstition runs through his singular and complex nature. Having satisfied himself now that there were no spies or listeners, he threw himself down into his armchair. "Munro," said he, prodding at me with his pipe, "what I wanted to tell you is that I am utterly, hopelessly, and irretrievably ruined." My chair was tilted on its back legs as he spoke, and I assure you that I was within an ace of going over. Down like a pack of cards came all my dreams as to the grand results which were to spring from my journey to Avonmouth. Yes, Bertie, I am bound to confess it, my first thought was of my own disappointment, and my second of the misfortune of my friends. He had the most diabolical intuitions, or I a very tell-tale face, for he added at once, "Sorry to disappoint you, my boy. That's not what you expected to hear, I can see." "Well," I stammered, "it is rather a surprise, old chap. I thought from the house and the footmen and the furniture," said he. "Well, they've eaten me up among them. Licked me clean, bones and gravy. I'm done for, my boy, unless—" here I saw question in his eyes, "unless some friend were to lend me his name on a bit of stamped paper." "I can't do it, Cullingworth," said I. It's a wretched thing to have to refuse a friend, and if I had money—" "Wait till you're asked, Munro," he interrupted, with his ugliest of expressions. "Besides, as you have nothing and no prospects, what earthly use would your name on a paper be?" "That's what I want to know," said I, feeling a little mortified none the less. "Look here, laddie," he went on. "Do you see that pile of letters on the left of the table?" "Yes." "Those are Dunn's. And do you see those documents on the right? Well, those are county court summonses. And now, do you see that?" He picked up a little ledger and showed me 3 or 4 names scribbled on the first page. "That's the practice," he roared, and laughed until the great veins jumped out on his forehead. His wife laughed heartily also, just as she would have wept had he been so disposed. "It's this way, Munro," said he, when he had got over his paroxysm. "You have probably heard, in fact I have told you myself, that my father had the finest practice in Scotland. As far as I could judge he was a man of no capacity, but still there you are. He had it." I nodded and smoked. "Well, he's been dead 7 years, and 50 nets dipping into his little fish pond. However, when I passed I thought my best move was to come down to the old place and see whether I couldn't piece the thing together again. The name ought to be worth something, I thought. But it was no use doing the thing in a half-hearted way. Not a bit of use in that, Munro. The kind of people who came to him were wealthy, and must see a fine house and a man in livery. What chance was there of gathering them into a bow-windowed 40-pound-a-year house with a grubby-faced maid at the door? What do you suppose I did? My boy, I took the governor's old house. That was unlet. The very house that he kept up at 5,000 a year. Off I started in rare style, and sank my last cent in furniture. But it's no use, laddie. I can't hold on any longer. I got 2 accidents and an epileptic. £22, 8 and 6 pence. That's the lot." "What will you do, then?" "That's what I wanted your advice about. That's why I wired for you. I always respected your opinion, my boy, and I thought now was the time to have it." It struck me that if he had asked for it 9 months before, there would have been more sense in it. What on earth could I do when affairs were in such a tangle? However, I could not help feeling complimented when so independent a fellow as Cullingworth turned to me in this way. "You really think," said I, "that it is no use holding on here?" He jumped up and began pacing the room in his swift, jerky way. "You take warning from it, Munro," said he. "You've got to start yet. Take my tip and go where no one knows you. People will trust a stranger quick enough. But if they can remember you as a little chap who ran about in knickerbockers and got spanked with a hairbrush for stealing plums, they are not going to put their lives in your keeping. It's all very well to talk about friendship and family connections, but when a man has a pain in the stomach, he doesn't care a toss about all that. I'd stick it up in gold letters in every medical classroom. Have it carved across the gate of the university that if a man wants friends, he must go among strangers. It's all up here, Munro, so there's no use in advising me to hold on." I asked him how much he owed. It came to about £700. The rent alone was £200. He had already raised money on the furniture, and his whole assets came to less than a tenner. Of course, there was only one possible thing that I could advise. "You must call your creditors together," said I. "They can see for themselves that you are young and energetic, sure to succeed sooner or later. If they push you into a corner now, they can get nothing. Make that clear to them. But if you make a fresh start elsewhere and succeed, you may pay them all in full. I see no other possible way out of it." "I knew you'd say that. And it's just what I thought myself, isn't it, Hetty? Well, then, that settles it, and I am much obliged to you for your advice. And that's all we'll say about the matter tonight. I've made my shot and missed. Next time I shall hit, and it won't be long either." His failure did not seem to weigh very heavily on his mind, for in a few minutes he was shouting away as lustily as ever. Whiskey and hot water were brought in, that we might all drink luck to the second venture. And this whiskey led us to what might have been a troublesome affair. Cullingworth, who had drunk off a couple of glasses, waited until his wife had left the room, and then began to talk of the difficulty of getting any exercise now that he had to wait all day in the hope of patience. This led us round to the ways in which a man might take his exercise indoors, and that to boxing. Cullingworth took a couple of pairs of gloves out of a cupboard, and proposed that we should fight a round or two then and there. If I hadn't been a fool, Bertie, I should never have consented. It's one of my many weaknesses that, whether it's a woman or a man, anything like a challenge sets me off. But I knew Cullingworth's ways, and I told you in my last what a lamb of a temper he has. None the less, we pushed back the table, put the lamp on a high bracket, and stood up to one another. The moment I looked him in the face, I smelled mischief. He had a gleam of settled malice in his eye. I believe it was my refusal to back his paper, which was running in his head. Anyway, he looked as dangerous as he could look, with his scowling face sunk forward a little, his hands down near his hips, for his boxing, like everything else about him, is unconventional, and his jaw set like a rat trap. I let off, and then in he came, hitting with both hands, and grunting like a pig at every blow. From what I could see of him, he was no boxer at all, but just a formidable rough-and-tumble fighter. I was guarding with both hands for half a minute, and then was rushed clean off my legs and banged up against the door, with my head nearly through one of the panels. He wouldn't stop then, though he saw that I had no space to get my elbows back, and he let fly a right-hander, which would have put me into the hall if I hadn't slipped it and got back to the middle of the room. "Look here, Collingworth," said I. "There's not much boxing about this game." "Yes, I hit pretty hard, don't I?" "If you come boring into me like that, I'm bound to hit you out again," I said. "I want to play light if you'll let me." The words were not out of my mouth before he was on me like a flash. I slipped him again, but the room was so small and he as active as a cat that there was no getting away from him. He was on me once more with a regular football rush that knocked me off my balance. Before I knew where I was, he got his left on the mark and his right on my ear. I tripped over a footstool, and then before I could get my balance, he had me on the same ear again, and my head was singing like a tea kettle. He was as pleased as possible with himself, blowing out his chest and slapping it with his palms as he took his place in the middle of the room. "Say when you've had enough, Munro," said he. This was pretty stiff, considering that I had 2 inches the better of him in height, and as many stone in weight, besides being the better boxer. His energy and the size of the room had been against me so far, but he wasn't to have all the slogging to himself in the next round if I could help it. In he came with one of his windmill rushes, but I was on the lookout for him this time. I landed him with my left, a regular nose-ender as he came, and then, ducking under his left, I got him a cross-counter on the jaw that laid him flat across his own hearthrug. He was up in an instant, with a face like a madman. "You swine!" he shouted. "Take off those gloves and put your hands up." He was tugging at his own to get them off. "Go on, you silly ass," said I. "What is there to fight about?" He was mad with passion, and chucked his gloves down under the table. "By God, Munro," he cried, "if you don't take those gloves off, I'll go for you, whether you have them on or not." "Have a glass of soda water," said I. He made a crack at me. "You're afraid of me, Munro. That's what's the matter with you," he snarled. This was getting too hot, Bertie. I saw all the folly of the thing. I believed that I might whip him, but at the same time I knew that we were so much of a match that we would both get pretty badly cut up without any possible object to serve. For all that I took my gloves off, and I think perhaps it was the wisest course after all. If Collingworth once thought he had the whip hand of you, you might be sorry for it afterwards. But as fate would have it, our little Barney was nipped in the bud. Mrs. Collingworth came into the room at that instant, and screamed out when she saw her husband. His nose was bleeding, and his chin was all slobbered with blood, so that I don't wonder that it gave her a turn. "James!" she screamed, and then to me, "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Munro?" You should have seen the hatred in her dove's eyes. I felt an insane impulse to pick her up and kiss her. "We've only been having a little spar, Mrs. Collingworth," said I. "Your husband was complaining that he never got any exercise." "It's all right, Hetty," said he, pulling his coat on again. "Don't be a little stupid. Are the servants gone to bed? Well, you might bring some water in a basin from the kitchen. Sit down, Munro, and light your pipe again. I have 100 things that I want to talk to you about." So that was the end of it, and all went smoothly for the rest of the evening. But for all that, the little wife will always look upon me as a brute and a bully, while as to Collingworth, well, it's rather difficult to say what Collingworth thinks about the matter. When I woke the next morning he was in my room, and a funny-looking object he was. His dressing-gown lay on a chair, and he was putting up a 56-pound dumbbell, without a rag to cover him. Nature didn't give him a very symmetrical face, nor the sweetest of expressions, but he has a figure like a Greek statue. I was amused to see that both his eyes had a touch of shadow to them. It was his turn to grin when I sat up and found that my ear was about the shape and consistency of a toadstool. However, he was all for peace that morning, and chatted away in the most amiable manner possible. I was to go back to my father's that day, but I had a couple of hours with Collingworth in his consulting room before I left. He was in his best form, and full of 100 fantastic schemes, by which I was to help him. His great object was to get his name into the newspapers. That was the basis of all success, according to his views. It seemed to me that he was confounding cause with effect, but I did not argue the point. I laughed until my sides ached over the grotesque suggestions which poured from him. I was to lie senseless in the roadway, and to be carried into him by a sympathizing crowd, while the footman ran with a paragraph to the newspapers. But there was the likelihood that the crowd might carry me into the rival practitioner opposite. In various disguises I was to feign fits at his very door, and so furnish fresh copy for the local press. Then I was to die, absolutely to expire, and all Scotland was to resound with how Dr. Collingworth of Avonmouth had resuscitated me. His ingenious brain rang 1,000 changes out of the idea, and his own impending bankruptcy was crowded right out of his thoughts by the flood of half-serious devices. But the thing that took the fun out of him and made him gnash his teeth and stride cursing about the room was to see a patient walking up the steps which led to the door of Scarsdale, his opposite neighbor. Scarsdale had a fairly busy practice, and received his people at home from 10 to 12, so that I got quite used to seeing Cullingworth fly out of his chair and rush raving to the window. He would diagnose the cases, too, and estimate their money value until he was hardly articulate. "There you are," he would suddenly yell. "See that man with a limp? Every morning he goes. Displaced semilunar cartilage, and a 3 months' job. The man's worth 35 shillings a week. And there! I'm hanged if the woman with rheumatic arthritis isn't round in her bath chair again. She's all sealskin and lactic acid. It's simply sickening to see how they crowd to that man. And such a man! You haven't seen him. All the better for you. I don't know what the devil you're laughing at, Munro. I can't see where the fun comes in myself. Well, it was a short experience, that visit to Avonmouth, but I think that I shall remember it all my life. Goodness knows you must be sick enough of the subject, but when I started with so much detail I was tempted to go. It ended by my going back again in the afternoon, Cullingworth assuring me that he would call all his creditors together, as I had advised, and that he would let me know the result in a few days. Mrs. Cullingworth would hardly shake hands with me when I said good-bye, but I like her the better for that. He must have a great deal of good in him, or he could not have won her love and confidence so completely. Perhaps there is another Cullingworth behind the scenes, a softer, tenderer man, who can love and invite love. If there is, I have never got near him, and yet I may only have been tapping at the shell. Who knows? For that matter, it is likely enough that he has never got at the real Johnny Munro. But you have, Bertie, and I think that you've had a little too much of him this time, only you encourage me to this sort of excess by your sympathetic replies. Well, I've done as much as the General Post Office will carry for 5 pence, so I'll conclude by merely remarking that a fortnight has passed and that I have had no news from Avonmouth, which does not in the very slightest degree surprise me. If I ever do hear anything, which is exceedingly doubtful, you may be sure that I will put a finish to this long story. End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of the Stark-Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Stark-Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 3. Home, 15th of October, 1881. Without any figure of speech, I feel quite ashamed when I think of you, Bertie. I send you 1 or 2 enormously long letters, burdened, as far as I can remember them, with all sorts of useless detail. Then, in spite of your kindly answers and your sympathy, which I have done so little to deserve, I drop you completely for more than 6 months. By this stray pen, I swear that it shall not happen again, and this letter may serve to bridge the gap and to bring you up to date in my poor affairs, in which, of all outer mankind, you alone take an interest. To commence with what is of most moment, you may rest assured that what you said in your last letter about religion has had my most earnest attention. I am sorry that I have not got it by me to refer to. I lent it to Charlie. But I think I have the contents in my head. It is notorious, as you say, that an unbeliever may be as bigoted as any of the orthodox, and that a man may be very dogmatic in his opposition to dogma. Such men are the real enemies of free thought. If anything could persuade me to turn traitor to my reason, it would, for example, be the blasphemous and foolish pictures displayed in some of the agnostic journals. But every movement has its crowd of camp followers who straggle and scatter. We are like a comet, bright at the head, but tailing away into mere gas behind. However, every man may speak for himself, and I do not feel that your charge comes home to me. I am only bigoted against bigotry, and that I hold to be as legitimate as violence to the violent. When one considers what effect the perversion of the religious instinct has had during the history of the world, the bitter wars, Christian and Mohammedan, Catholic and Protestant, the persecutions, the torturings, the domestic hatreds, the petty spites, with all creeds equally blood–guilty. One cannot but be amazed that the concurrent voice of mankind has not placed bigotry at the very head of the deadly sins. It is surely a truism to say that neither small–pox nor the plague have brought the same misery upon mankind. I cannot be bigoted, my dear boy, when I say from the bottom of my heart that I respect every good Catholic and every good Protestant, and that I recognize that each of these forms of faith has been a powerful instrument in the hands of that inscrutable Providence which rules all things. Just as in the course of history one finds that the most far–reaching and admirable effects may proceed from a crime, so in religion, although a creed can be founded upon an entirely inadequate conception of the Creator and his ways, it may none the less be the very best practical thing for the people and age which have adopted it. But if it is right for those to whom it is intellectually satisfying to adopt it, it is equally so for those to whom it is not, to protest against it, until by this process the whole mass of mankind gets gradually leavened, and pushed a little further upon their slow upward journey. Catholicism is the more thorough, Protestantism is the more reasonable. Protestantism adapts itself to modern civilization. Catholicism expects civilization to adapt itself to it. Folk climb from one big branch to the other big branch, and think they have made a prodigious change, when the main trunk is rotten beneath them, and both must in their present forms be involved sooner or later in a common ruin. The movement of human thought, though slow, is still in the direction of truth, and the various religions which man sheds as he advances, each admirable in its day, will serve, like buoys dripped down from a sailing–vessel, to give the rate and direction of his progress. But how do I know what is truth, you ask? I don't. But I know particularly well what isn't. And surely that is something to have gained. It isn't true that the great central mind that planned all things is capable of jealousy, or of revenge, or of cruelty, or of injustice. These are human attributes, and the book which ascribes them to the Infinite must be human also. It isn't true that the laws of nature have been capriciously disturbed, that snakes have talked, that women have been turned to salt, that rods have brought water out of rocks. You must in honesty confess that if these things were presented to us when we were adults for the first time, we should smile at them. It isn't true that the fountain of all common sense should punish a race for a venial offence committed by a person long since dead, and then should add to the crass injustice by heaping the whole retribution upon a single innocent scapegoat. Can you not see all the want of justice and logic, to say nothing of the want of mercy, involved in such a conception? Can you not see it, Bertie? How can you blind yourself to it? Take your eyes away from the details for a moment, and look at this root idea of the predominant faith. Is the general conception of it consistent with infinite wisdom and mercy? If not, what becomes of the dogmas, the sacraments, the whole scheme which is founded upon this sandbank? Courage, my friend. At the right moment all will be laid aside, as the man whose strength increases lays down the crutch which has been a good friend to him in his weakness. But his changes won't be over then. His hobble will become a walk, and his walk a run. There is no finality, can be none, since the question concerns the infinite. All this, which appears to advance to you to–day, will seem reactionary and conservative 1,000 years hence. Since I am upon this topic, may I say just a little more without boring you? You say that criticism such as mine is merely destructive, and that I have nothing to offer in place of what I pull down. This is not quite correct. I think that there are certain elemental truths within our grasp which ask for no faith for their acceptance, and which are sufficient to furnish us with a practical religion, having so much of reason in it, that it would draw thinking men into its fold, not drive them forth from it. When we all get back to these elemental and provable facts, there will be some hopes of ending the petty bickerings of creeds, and of including the whole human family in one comprehensive system of thought. When first I came out of the faith in which I had been reared, I certainly did feel for a time as if my life belt had burst. I won't exaggerate and say that I was miserable and plunged into utter spiritual darkness. Youth is too full of action for that. But I was conscious of a vague unrest, of a constant want of repose, of an emptiness and hardness which I had not noticed in life before. I had so identified religion with the Bible that I could not conceive them apart. When the foundation proved false, the whole structure came rattling about my ears. And then good old Carlyle came to the rescue, and partly from him and partly from my own broodings, I made a little hut of my own, which has kept me snug ever since, and has even served to shelter a friend or two besides. The first and main thing was to get it thoroughly soaked into one that the existence of a Creator, and an indication of his attributes, does in no way depend upon Jewish poets, nor upon human paper or printing ink. On the contrary, all such efforts to realize him must only belittle him, bringing the infinite down to the narrow terms of human thought, at a time when the thought was in the main less spiritual than it is at present. Even the most material of modern minds would flinch at depicting the Deity as ordering wholesale executions, and hacking kings to pieces upon the horns of altars. Then, having prepared your mind for a higher, if perhaps a vaguer idea of the Deity, proceed to study him in his works, which cannot be counterfeited or manipulated. Nature is the true revelation of the Deity to man. The nearest green field is the inspired page from which you may read all that it is needful for you to know. I confess that I have never been able to understand the position of the atheist. In fact, I have come to disbelieve in his existence, and to look upon the word as a mere term of theological reproach. It may represent a temporary condition, a passing mental phase, a defiant reaction against the anthropomorphic ideal, but I cannot conceive that any man may continue to survey nature and to deny that there are laws at work which display intelligence and power. The very existence of a world carries with it the proof of a world-maker, as the table guarantees the pre-existence of the carpenter. Granting this, one may form what conception one will of that maker, but one cannot be an atheist. Wisdom and power and means directed to an end run all through the scheme of nature. What proof do we want, then, from a book? If the man who observes the myriad stars, and considers that they and their innumerable satellites move in the serene dignity through the heavens, each swinging clear of the other's orbit, if, I say, the man who sees this cannot realize the Creator's attributes without the help of the book of Job, then his view of things is beyond my understanding. Nor is it only in the large things that we see the ever-present solicitude of some intelligent force. Nothing is too tiny for that fostering care. We see the minute proboscis of the insect carefully adjusted to fit into the calyx of the flower, the most microscopic hair and gland, each with its definite purposeful function to perform. What matter whether these came by special creation or by evolution? We know as a matter of fact that they came by evolution, but that only defines the law, it does not explain it. But if this power has cared for the bee so as to furnish it with its honey-bag for its collecting forceps, and for the lowly seed so as to have 1,000 devices by which it reaches a congenial soil, then is it conceivable that we, the highest product of all, are overlooked? It is not conceivable. The idea is inconsistent with the scheme of creation as we see it. I say again that no faith is needed to attain the certainty of a most watchful Providence. And with this certainty surely we have all that is necessary for an elemental religion. Come what may after death, our duties lie clearly defined before us in this life, and the ethical standard of all creeds agrees so far that there is not likely to be any difference of opinion as to that. The last Reformation simplified Catholicism. The coming one will simplify Protestantism, and when the world is ripe for it, another will come and simplify that. The ever-improving brain will give us an ever-broadening creed. Is it not glorious to think that evolution is still living and acting, that if we have an anthropoid ape as an ancestor, we may have archangels for our posterity? Well, I really never intended to inflict all this upon you, Bertie. I thought I could have made my position clear in a page or so. But you can see how one point has brought up another. Even now I am leaving so much unsaid. I can see with such certainty exactly what you will say. If you deduce a good providence from the good things in nature, what do you make of the evil? That's what you will say. Suffice it that I am inclined to deny the existence of evil. Not another word will I say upon the subject, but if you come back to it yourself, then be it on your own head. You remember that when I wrote last I had just returned from visiting the Cullingworths at Avonmouth, and that he had promised to let me know what steps he took in appeasing his creditors. As I expected, I have not had one word from him since, but in a roundabout way I did get some news as to what happened. From this account, which was second-hand, and may have been exaggerated, Cullingworth did exactly what I had recommended, and calling all his creditors together, he made them a long statement as to his position. The good people were so touched by the picture that he drew of a worthy man fighting against adversity that several of them wept, and there was not only complete unanimity as to letting their bills stand over, but even some talk of a collection then and there to help Cullingworth on his way. He has, I understand, left Avonmouth, but no one has any idea of what has become of him. It is generally supposed that he has gone to England. He is a strange fellow, but I wish him luck wherever he goes. When I came back I settled down once more to the routine of my father's practice, holding on there until something may turn up. And for 6 months I have had to wait. A weary 6 months they have been. You see, I cannot ask my father for money, or at least I cannot bring myself to take an unnecessary penny of his money, for I know how hard a fight it is with him to keep the roof over our heads, and pay for the modest little horse and trap, which are as necessary to his trade as a goose is to a tailor. Foul fare the grasping taxman, who wrings a couple of guineas from us on the plea that it is a luxury. We can just hold on, and I would not have him a pound the poorer for me. But you can understand, Bertie, that it is humiliating for a man of my age to have to go about without any money in my pocket. It affects me in so many petty ways. A poor man may do me a kindness, and I have to seem mean in his eyes. I may want a flower for a girl, and must be content to appear ungallant. I don't know why I should be ashamed of this, since it is no fault of mine, and I hope that I don't show it to any one else that I am ashamed of it. But to you, my dear Bertie, I don't mind confessing that it hurts my self-respect terribly. I have often wondered why some of those writing fellows don't try their hands at drawing the inner life of a young man from about the age of puberty until he begins to find his feet a little. Men are very fond of analysing the feelings of their heroines, which they cannot possibly know anything about, while they have little to say on the inner development of their heroes, which is an experience which they have themselves undergone. I should like to try it myself, but it would need blending with fiction, and I never had a spark of imagination. But I have a vivid recollection of what I went through myself. At the time I thought, as everybody thinks, that it was a unique experience, but since I have heard the confidences of my father's patients, I am convinced that it is the common lot. The shrinking, horrible shyness, alternating with occasional absurd fits of audacity, which represent the reaction against it, the longing for close friendship, the agonies over imaginary slights, the extraordinary sexual doubts, the deadly fears caused by non-existent diseases, the vague emotion produced by all women, and the half-frightened thrill by particular ones. The aggressiveness caused by fear of being afraid, the sudden blacknesses, the profound self–distrust. I dare bet that you have felt every one of them, Bertie, just as I have, and that the first lad of 18 whom you see out of your window is suffering from them now. This is all a digression, however, from the fact that I have been 6 months at home and am weary of it, and pleased at the new development of which I shall have to tell you. The practice here, although unremunerative, is very busy with its 3 and 6-penny visits and guinea confinements, so that both the governor and I have plenty to do. You know how I admire him, and yet I fear there is little intellectual sympathy between us. He appears to think that those opinions of mine upon religion and politics which come hot from my inmost soul have been assumed either out of indifference or bravado. So I have ceased to talk on vital subjects with him, and, though we affect to ignore it, we both know that there is a barrier there. Now, with my mother— but my mother must have a paragraph to herself. You met her, Bertie. You must remember her sweet face, her sensitive mouth, her peering short–sighted eyes, her general suggestion of a little plump hen, who is still on the alert about her chickens. But you cannot realize all that she is to me in our domestic life. Those helpful fingers, that sympathetic brain. Ever since I can remember her, she has been the quaintest mixture of the housewife and the woman of letters, with the high–bred spirited lady as a basis for either character. Always a lady, whether she was bargaining with the butcher, or breaking in a skittish charwoman, or stirring the porridge, which I can see her doing with the porridge–stick in one hand, and the other holding her Revue des Deux Mondes within 2 inches of her dear nose. That was always her favourite reading, and I can never think of her without the association of its browny–yellow cover. She is a well–read woman, is the mother. She keeps up to date in French literature as well as in English, and can talk by the hour about the Goncourt and Flaubert and Gautier. Yet she is always hard at work, and how she imbibes all her knowledge is a mystery. She reads when she knits, she reads when she scrubs, she even reads when she feeds her babies. We have a little joke against her, that at an interesting passage she deposited a spoonful of rusk and milk into my little sister's ear–hole, the child having turned her head at the critical instant. Her hands are worn with work, and yet where is the idle woman who has read so much? Then there is her family pride. That is the very vital portion of the mother. You know how little I think of such things. If the esquire were to be snipped once and for ever from the tail of my name, I should be the lighter for it. But, ma foi, to use her own favourite expletive, it would not do to say this to her. On the Pakenham side she is a Pakenham. The family can boast of some fairly good men, I mean on the direct line, but when we get to the side branches, there is not a monarch upon earth who does not roost on that huge family tree. Not once, nor twice, but thrice did the Plantagenets intermarry with us, the Dukes of Brittany courted our alliance, and the Percys of Northumberland intertwined themselves with our whole illustrious record. So in my boyhood she would expound the matter, with hearth–brush in one hand and a glove full of cinders in the other, while I would sit swinging my knickerbockered legs, swelling with pride until my waistcoat was as tight as a sausage–skin, as I contemplated the gulf which separated me from all other little boys who swung their legs upon tables. To this day, if I chance to do anything of which she strongly approves, the dear heart can say no more than that I am a thorough Pakenham; while if I fall away from the straight path, she says with a sigh that there are points in which I take after the Munros. She is broad–minded and intensely practical in her ordinary moods, though open to attacks of romance. I can recollect her coming to see me at a junction through which my train passed, with a 6 months' absence on either side of the incident. We had 5 minutes' conversation, my head out of the carriage window. "Wear flannel next your skin, my dear boy, and never believe in eternal punishment. was her last item of advice as we rolled out of the station. Then, to finish her portrait, I need not tell you, who have seen her, that she is young looking and comely to be the mother of about 35 feet of humanity. She was in the railway carriage, and I on the platform, the other day. "Your husband had better get in, or we'll go without him," said the guard. As we went off, the mother was fumbling furiously in her pocket, and I know that she was looking for a shilling. Ah, what a gossip I have been! And all to lead up to the one sentence that I could not have stayed at home this 6 months if it had not been for the company and the sympathy of my mother. Well now, I want to tell you about the scrape that I got myself into. I suppose that I ought to pull a long face over it, but for the life of me I can't help laughing. I have you almost up to date in my history now, for what I am going to tell you happened only last week. I must mention no names here even to you, for the curse of Ennulphus, which includes 48 minor imprecations, be upon the head of the man who kisses and tells. You must know, then, that within the boundaries of this city there are 2 ladies, a mother and a daughter, whom I shall call Mrs. and Miss Laura Andrews. They are patients of the governor's, and have become to some extent friends of the family. Madame is Welsh, charming in appearance, dignified in her manners, and high church in her convictions. The daughter is rather taller than the mother, but otherwise they are strikingly alike. The mother is 36, and the daughter 18. Both are exceedingly charming. Had I to choose between them, I think, entre nous, that the mother would have attracted me most, for I am thoroughly of Balzac's opinion as to the woman of 30. However, fate was to will it otherwise. It was the coming home from a dance which first brought Laura and me together. You know how easily and suddenly these things happen, beginning in playful teasing, and ending in something a little warmer than friendship. You squeeze the slender arm which is passed through yours, you venture to take the little gloved hand, you say good night at absurd length, in the shadow of the door. It is innocent and very interesting, love trying its wings in a first little flutter. He will keep his sustained flight later on, the better for the practice. There was never any question of engagements between us, nor any suggestion of harm. She knew that I was a poor devil with neither means nor prospects, and I knew that her mother's will was her law, and that her course was already marked out for her. However, we exchanged our little confidences, and met occasionally by appointment, and tried to make our lives brighter without darkening those of any one else. I can see you shake your head here and growl, like the comfortable married man that you are, that such relations are very dangerous. So they are, my boy, but neither of us cared, she out of innocence and I out of recklessness, for, from the beginning, all the fault in the matter was mine. Well, matters were in this state when, one day last week, a note came up to the dad saying that Mrs. Andrews' servant was ill, and could he come at once. The old man had a touch of gout, so I donned my professional coat and sallied forth, thinking that perhaps I might combine pleasure with business, and have a few words with Laura. Sure enough, as I passed up the gravel drive which curves round to the door, I glanced through the drawing-room window, and saw her sitting painting, with her back to the light. It was clear that she had not heard me. The hall door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, no one was in the hall. A sudden fit of roguishness came over me. I pushed the drawing-room door very slowly wider, crept in on tiptoe, stole quietly across, and bending down, I kissed the artist upon the nape of her neck. She turned round with a squeal, and it was the mother. I don't know whether you have been in a tighter corner than that, Bertie. It was quite tight enough for me. I remember that I smiled as I stole across the carpet on that insane venture. I did not smile again that evening. It makes me hot now when I think of it. Well, I made the most dreadful fool of myself. At first, the good lady, who, as I think I told you, is very dignified and rather reserved, could not believe her senses. Then, as the full force of my enormity came upon her, she reared herself up until she seemed the tallest and the coldest woman I had ever seen. It was an interview with a refrigerator. She asked me what I had ever observed in her conduct which had encouraged me to subject her to such an outrage. I saw, of course, that any excuses upon my part would put her on the right track, and give poor Laura away. So I stood with my hair bristling and my top hat in my hand, presenting, I am sure, a most extraordinary figure. Indeed, she looked rather funny herself, with her palette in one hand, her brush in the other, and the blank astonishment on her face. I stammered out something about hoping that she did not mind, which made her more angry than ever. "The only possible excuse for your conduct, sir, is that you are under the influence of drink," said she. "I need not say that we do not require the services of a medical man in that condition." I did not try to disabuse her of the idea, for really I could see no better explanation, so I beat a retreat in a very demoralized condition. She wrote a letter to my father about it in the evening, and the old man was very angry indeed. As to the mother, she is as staunch as steel, and quite prepared to prove that poor Mrs. A. was a very deep designing woman, who had laid a trap for innocent Johnny. So there has been a grand row, and not a soul upon earth has the least idea of what it all means, except only yourself as you read this letter. You can imagine that this has not contributed to make life here more pleasant, for my father cannot bring himself to forgive me. Of course, I don't wonder at his anger. I should be just the same myself. It does look like a shocking breach of professional honour, and a sad disregard of his interests. If he knew the truth, he would see that it was nothing worse than a silly, ill-timed, boyish joke. However, he never shall know the truth. And now there is some chance of my getting something to do. We had a letter to-night from Christie & Howden, the writers to the Signet, saying that they desire an interview with me, in view of a possible appointment. We can't imagine what it means, but I am full of hopes. I go to-morrow to see them, and I shall let you know the result. Good-bye, my dear Bertie. Your life flows in a steady stream, and mine in a broken torrent. Yet I would have every detail of what happens to you. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 4. Home, 1st of December, 1881. I may be doing you an injustice, Bertie, but it seemed to me in your last that there were indications that the free expression of my religious views had been distasteful to you. That you should disagree with me I am prepared for, but that you should object to free and honest discussion of those subjects which above all others men should be honest over, would, I confess, be a disappointment. The freethinker is placed at this disadvantage in ordinary society, that whereas it would be considered very bad taste upon his part to obtrude his unorthodox opinion, no such consideration hampers those with whom he disagrees. There was a time when it took a brave man to be a Christian. Now it takes a brave man not to be. But if we are to wear a gag, and hide our thoughts when writing in confidence to our most intimate, no, but I won't believe it. You and I have put up too many thoughts together, and chased them wherever they would double, Bertie. So just write to me like a good fellow, and tell me that I am an ass. Until I have that comforting assurance, I shall place a quarantine upon everything which could conceivably be offensive to you. Does not lunacy strike you, Bertie, as being a very eerie thing? It is a disease of the soul. To think that you may have a man of noble mind, full of every lofty aspiration, and that a gross physical cause, such as the fall of a spicule of bone from the inner table of his skull on to the surface of the membrane which covers his brain, may have the ultimate effect of turning him into an obscene creature with every bestial attribute. That a man's individuality should swing round from pole to pole, and yet that one life should contain those two contradictory personalities, is it not a wondrous thing? I ask myself, where is the man, the very, very inmost essence of the man? See how much you may subtract from him without touching it. It does not lie in the limbs which serve him as tools, nor in the apparatus by which he is to digest, nor in that by which he is to inhale oxygen. All these are mere accessories, the slaves of the Lord within. Where, then, is he? He does not lie in the features which are to express his emotions, nor in the eyes and ears which can be dispensed with by the blind and deaf. Nor is he in the bony framework which is the rack over which nature hangs her veil of flesh. In none of these things lies the essence of the man. And now what is left? An arched, whitish, putty-like mass, some 50-odd ounces in weight, with a number of white filaments hanging down from it, looking not unlike a medusae which float in our summer seas. But these filaments only serve to conduct nerve force to muscles and to organs which serve secondary purposes. They may themselves therefore be disregarded. Nor can we stop here in our elimination. This central mass of nervous matter may be pared down on all sides before we seem to get at the very seat of the soul. Suicides have shot away the front lobes of the brain, and have lived to repent it. Surgeons have cut down upon it, and have removed sections. Much of it is merely for the purpose of furnishing the springs of motion, and much for the reception of impressions. All this may be put aside as we search for the physical seat of what we call the soul, the spiritual part of the man. And what is left then? A little blob of matter, a handful of nervous dough, a few ounces of tissue. But there, somewhere there, lurks that impalpable seed, to which the rest of our fame is but the pod. The old philosophers who put the soul in the pineal gland were not right, but after all they were uncommonly near the mark. You'll find my physiology even worse than my theology, Bertie. I have a way of telling stories backwards to you, which is natural enough when you consider that I always sit down to write under the influence of the last impressions which have come upon me. All this talk about the soul and the brain arises simply from the fact that I have been spending the last few weeks with a lunatic, and how it came about I will tell you as clearly as I can. You remember that in my last I explained to you how restive I had been getting at home, and how my idiotic mistake had annoyed my father, and had made my position here very uncomfortable. Then I mentioned, I think, that I had received a letter from Christie and Howden, the lawyers. Well, I brushed up my Sunday hat, and my mother stood on a chair and landed me twice on the ear with a clothes-brush, under the impression that she was making the collar of my overcoat look more presentable. With which accolade out I sallied into the world, the dear soul standing on the steps, peering after me and waving me success. Well, I was in considerable trepidation when I reached the office, for I am a much more nervous person than any of my friends will ever credit me with being. However, I was shown in at once to Mr. James Christie, a wiry, sharp, thin-lipped kind of man, with an abrupt manner, and that sort of Scotch precision of speech which gives the impression of clearness of thought behind it. "I understand from Professor Maxwell that you have been looking about for an opening, Mr. Munro," said he. Maxwell had said that he would give me a hand if he could, but you remember that he had a reputation for giving such promises rather easily. I speak of a man as I find him, and to me he has been an excellent friend. "I should be very happy to hear of any opening," said I. "Of your medical qualifications there is no need to speak," he went on, running his eyes all over me in the most questioning way. "Your bachelorship of medicine will answer for that. But Professor Maxwell thought you particularly fitted for this vacancy for physical reasons. May I ask what your weight is?" 14 stone. "And you stand, I should judge, about 6 feet high?" "Precisely." Accustomed, too, as I gather, to muscular exercise of every kind. Well, there can be no question that you are the very man for the post, and I shall be very happy to recommend you to Lord Saltire." "You forget," said I, "that I have not yet heard what the position is, or the terms which you offer." He began to laugh at that. "It was a little precipitate on my part," said he, "but I do not think that we are likely to quarrel as to position or terms. You may have heard, perhaps, of the sad misfortune of our client, Lord Saltire. Not? To put it briefly, then, his son, the Honourable James Derwent, the heir to the estates and the only child, was struck down by the sun while fishing without his hat last July. His mind has never recovered from the shock, and he has been ever since in a chronic state of moody sullenness, which breaks out every now and then into violent mania. His father will not allow him to be removed from Lochtully Castle, and it is his desire that a medical man should stay there in constant attendance upon his son. Your physical strength would of course be very useful in restraining those violent attacks of which I have spoken. The remuneration will be £12 a month, and you will be required to take over your duties to morrow." I walked home, my dear Bertie, with a bounding heart, and the pavement like cotton wool under my feet. I found just 8 pence in my pocket, and I spent the whole of it on a really good cigar, with which to celebrate the occasion. Old Cullingworth has always had a very high opinion of lunatics for beginners. "Get a lunatic, my boy, get a lunatic," he used to say. Then it was not only the situation, but the fine connection that it opened up. I seemed to see exactly what would happen. There would be illness in the family, Lord Saltire himself perhaps, or his wife. There would be no time to send for advice. I would be consulted. I would gain their confidence, and become their family attendant. They would recommend me to their wealthy friends. It was all as clear as possible. I was debating before I reached home whether it would be worth my while to give up a lucrative country practice in order to take the professorship which might be offered me. My father took the news philosophically enough, with some rather sardonic remark about my patient and me being well qualified to keep each other company. But to my mother it was a flash of joy, followed by a thunderclap of consternation. I had only 3 undershirts. The best of my linen had gone to Belfast to be refronted and recuffed. The nightgowns were not marked yet. There were dozens of those domestic difficulties of which the mere male never thinks. A dreadful vision of Lady Saltire looking over my things and finding the heel out of one of my socks obsessed my mother. Out we trudged together, and before evening her soul was at rest, and I had mortgaged in advance my first month's salary. She was great as we walked home upon the grand people into whose service I was to enter. "As a matter of fact, my dear," said she, "they are in a sense relations of yours. You are very closely allied to the Percys, and the Saltires have Percy blood in them also. They are only a cadet branch, and you are close upon the main line, but still it is not for us to deny the connection." She brought a cold sweat out upon me by suggesting that she should make things easy by writing to Lord Saltire and explaining our respective positions. Several times during the evening I heard her murmur complacently that they were only the cadet branch. Am I not the slowest of story tellers? But you encourage me to it by your sympathetic interest in details. However, I shall move along a little faster now. Next morning I was off to Lochtully, which, as you know, is in the north of Perthshire. It stands 3 miles from the station, a great grey pinnacled house, with 2 towers cocking out above the firwoods like a hare's ears from a tussock of grass. As we drove up to the door I felt pretty solemn, not at all as the main line should do when it condescends to visit the cadet branch. Into the hall as I entered came a grave, learned-looking man, with whom in my nervousness I was about to shake hands cordially. Fortunately he forestalled the impending embrace by explaining that he was the butler. He showed me into a small study, where everything stank of varnish and morocco leather, there to await the great man. He proved, when he came, to be a much less formidable figure than his retainer. Indeed, I felt thoroughly at my ease with him from the moment he opened his mouth. He is grizzled, red-faced, sharp-featured, with a prying and yet benevolent expression, very human, and just a trifle vulgar. His wife, however, to whom I was afterwards introduced, is a most depressing person, pale, cold, hatchet-faced, with drooping eyelids and very prominent blue veins at her temples. She froze me up again, just as I was budding out under the influence of her husband. However, the thing that interested me most of all was to see my patient, to whose room I was taken by Lord Saltire after we had had a cup of tea. The room was a large, bare one, at the end of a long corridor. Near the door was seated a footman, placed there to fill up the gap between two doctors, and looking considerably relieved at my advent. Over by the window, which was furnished with a wooden guard, like that of a nursery, sat a tall, yellow-haired, yellow-bearded young man, who raised a pair of startled blue eyes as we entered. He was turning over the pages of a bound copy of the Illustrated London News. "James," said Lord Saltire, "this is Dr. Stark Munro, who has come to look after you." My patient mumbled something in his beard, which seemed to me suspiciously like "Damn Dr. Stark Munro." The peer evidently thought the same, for he led me aside by the elbow. "I don't know whether you have been told that James is a little rough in his ways at present," said he. "His whole nature has deteriorated very much since this calamity came upon him. You must not be offended by anything he may say or do." "Not in the least," said I. "There is a taint of this sort upon my wife's side," whispered the little lord. "Her uncle's symptoms were identical. Dr. Peterson says that the sunstroke was only the determining cause. The predisposition was already there. I may tell you that the footman will always be in the next room, so that you can call him if you need his assistance." Well, it ended by lord and lackey moving off, and leaving me with my patient. I thought that I should lose no time in establishing a kindly relation with him, so I drew a chair over to his sofa, and began to ask him a few questions about his health and habits. Not a word could I get out of him in reply. He sat as sullen as a mule, with a kind of sneer about his handsome face, which showed me very well that he had heard everything. I tried this and tried that, but not a syllable could I get from him. So at last I turned from him and began to look over some illustrated papers on the table. He doesn't read, it seems, and will do nothing but look at pictures. Well, I was sitting like this, with my back half turned, when you can imagine my surprise to feel something plucking gently at me, and to see a great brown hand trying to slip its way into my coat pocket. I caught at the wrist and turned swiftly round, but too late to prevent my handkerchief being whisked out and concealed behind the Honourable James Derwent, who sat grinning at me like a mischievous monkey. "Come, I may want that," said I, trying to treat the matter as a joke. He used some language which was more scriptural than religious. I saw that he did not mean giving it up, but I was determined not to let him get the upper hand over me. I grabbed for the handkerchief, and he, with a snarl, caught my hand in both of his. He had a powerful grip, but I managed to get his wrist and to give it a wrench round, until, with a howl, he dropped my property. "What fun!" said I, pretending to laugh. "Let us try again. Now, you take it up and see if I can get it again." But he had had enough of that game, yet he appeared to be better humoured than before the incident, and I got a few short answers to the questions which I put to him. And here comes in the text which started me preaching about lunacy at the beginning of this letter. What a marvellous thing it is! This man, from all I can learn of him, has suddenly swung clean over from one extreme of character to the other. Every plus has in an instant become a minus. He's another man, but in the same case. I am told that he used to be, only a few months ago, mind you, most fastidious in dress and speech. Now he is a foul-tongued rough. He had a nice taste in literature. Now he stares at you if you speak of Shakespeare. Queerest of all, he used to be a very high and dry Tory in his opinions. He is fond now of airing the most democratic views, and in a needlessly offensive way. When I did get on terms with him at last, I found that there was nothing on which he could be drawn on to talk so soon as on politics. In substance, I am bound to say that I think his new views are probably saner than his old ones, but the insanity lies in his sudden reasonless change and in his violent blurts of speech. It was some weeks, however, before I gained his confidence, so far as to be able to hold a real conversation with him. For a long time he was sullen and suspicious, resenting the constant watch which I kept upon him. This could not be relaxed, for he was full of the most apish tricks. One day he got hold of my tobacco pouch, and stuffed 2 ounces of my tobacco into the long barrel of an Eastern gun which hangs on the wall. He jammed it all down with the ramrod, and I was never able to get it up again. Another time he threw an earthenware spittoon through the window, and would have sent the clock after it, had I not prevented him. Every day I took him for a 2 hours' constitutional, save when it rained, and then we walked religiously for the same space up and down the room. But it was a deadly, dreary kind of life. I was supposed to have my eye upon him all day, with a 2 hour interval every afternoon, and an evening to myself upon Fridays. But then what was the use of an evening to myself when there was no town near, and I had no friends whom I could visit? I did a fair amount of reading, for Lord Saltire let me have the run of his library. Gibbon gave me a couple of enchanting weeks. You know the effect that he produces. You seem to be serenely floating upon a cloud, and looking down on all these pigmy armies and navies, with a wise mentor ever at your side to whisper to you the inner meaning of all that majestic panorama. Now and again young Derwent introduced some excitement into my dull life. On one occasion, when we were walking in the grounds, he suddenly snatched up a spade from a grass plot and rushed at an inoffensive under gardener. The man ran screaming for his life, with my patient cursing at his very heels, and me within a few paces of him. When I at last laid my hands on his collar, he threw down his weapon and burst into shrieks of laughter. It was only mischief, and not ferocity, but when that under gardener saw us coming after that, he was off with a face like a cream cheese. At night the attendant slept in a camp bed at the foot of the patient's, and my room was next door, so that I could be called if necessary. No, it was not a very exhilarating life. We used to go down to family meals when there were no visitors, and there we made a curious quartet. Jimmy, as he wished me to call him, glum and silent, I with the tail of my eye always twisted round to him; Lady Saltire, with her condescending eyelids and her blue veins; and the good-natured peer, fussy and genial, but always rather subdued in the presence of his wife. She looked as if a glass of good wine would do her good, and he as if he would be the better for abstinence. And so, in accordance with the usual lopsidedness of life, he drank freely, and she took nothing but lime-juice and water. You cannot imagine a more ignorant, intolerant, narrow-minded woman than she. If she had only been content to be silent, and hidden that small brain of hers, it would not have mattered. But there was no end to her bitter and exasperating clacking. What was she after all but a thin pipe for conveying disease from one generation to another? She was bounded by insanity upon the north and upon the south. I resolutely set myself to avoid all argument with her, but she knew, with her woman's instinct, that we were as far apart as the poles, and took a pleasure in waving the red flag before me. One day she was waxing eloquent as to the crime of a minister of an Episcopal church performing any service in a Presbyterian chapel. Some neighbouring minister had done it, it seems, and if he had been marked down in a pot-house she could not have spoken with greater loathing. I suppose that my eyes were less under control than my tongue, for she suddenly turned upon me with, "I see that you don't agree with me, Dr. Munro." I replied quietly that I did not, and tried to change the conversation, but she was not to be shaken off. "Why not, may I ask?" I explained that in my opinion the tendency of the age was to break down those ridiculous doctrinal points which are so useless, and which have for so long set people by the ears. I added that I hoped the time was soon coming when good men of all creeds would throw this lumber overboard, and join hands together. She half rose, almost speechless with indignation. "I presume," said she, "that you are one of those people who would separate the Church from the State." "Most certainly," I answered. She stood erect, in a kind of cold fury, and swept out of the room. Jimmy began to chuckle, and his father looked perplexed. "I am sorry that my opinions are offensive to Lady Saltire," I remarked. "Yes, yes, it's a pity, said he. "Well, well, we must say what we think. But it's a pity you think it a very great pity." I quite expected to get my dismissal over this business, and indeed indirectly I may say that I did so. From that day Lady Saltire was as rude to me as she could be, and never lost an opportunity of making attacks upon what she imagined to be my opinions. Of these I never took the slightest notice, but at last on an evil day she went for me point blank, so that there was no getting away from her. It was just at the end of lunch, when the footman had left the room. She had been talking about Lord Saltire's going up to London to vote upon some question in the House of Lords. "Perhaps, Dr. Munro," said she, turning acidly upon me, "that is also an institution which has not been fortunate enough to win your approval." "It is a question, Lady Saltire, which I should much prefer not to discuss," I answered. "Oh, you might as well have the courage of your convictions," said she. "Since you desire to despoil the national church, it is natural enough that you should wish also to break up the constitution. I have heard that an atheist is always a red republican." Lord Saltire rose, wishing, I have no doubt, to put an end to the conversation. Jimmy and I rose also, and suddenly I saw that instead of moving towards the door, he was going to his mother. Knowing his little tricks, I passed my hand under his arm and tried to steer him away. She noticed it, however, and interfered. "Did you wish to speak to me, James?" "I want to whisper in your ear, mother." "Pray don't excite yourself, sir," said I, again attempting to detain him. Lady Saltire arched her aristocratic eyebrows. "I think, Dr. Munro, that you push your authority rather far when you venture to interfere between a mother and her son," said she. "What was it, my poor dear boy?" Jimmy bent down and whispered something in her ear. The blood rushed into her pale face, and she sprang from him as if he had struck her. Jimmy began to snigger. "This is your doing, Dr. Munro," she cried furiously. "You have corrupted my son's mind, and encouraged him to insult his mother." "My dear," said her husband soothingly, and I quietly led the recalcitrant Jimmy upstairs. I asked him what it was that he had said to his mother, but only got chuckles in reply. I had a presentiment that I should hear more of the matter, and I was not wrong. Lord Saltire called me into his study in the evening. "The fact is, doctor," said he, "that Lady Saltire has been extremely annoyed and grieved about what occurred at lunch to day. Of course you can imagine that such an expression coming from her own son shocked her more than I can tell." "I assure you, Lord Saltire," said I, "that I have no idea at all what passed between Lady Saltire and my patient." "Well," said he, "without going into details, I may say that what he whispered was a blasphemous wish, most coarsely expressed, as to the future of that upper house, to which I have the honour to belong." "I am very sorry," said I, "and I assure you that I have never encouraged him in his extreme political views, which seem to me to be symptoms of his disease." "I am quite convinced that what you say is true," he answered, "but Lady Saltire is unhappily of the opinion that you have instilled these ideas into him. You know that it is a little difficult sometimes to reason with a lady. However, I have no doubt that all may be smoothed over if you would see Lady Saltire and assure her that she has misunderstood your views upon this point, and that you are personally a supporter of a hereditary chamber." It put me in a tight corner, Bertie, but my mind was instantly made up. From the first word I had read my dismissal in every uneasy glance of his little eyes. "I am afraid," said I, "that is rather further than I am prepared to go. I think that since there has been for some weeks a certain friction between Lady Saltire and myself, it would perhaps be as well that I should resign the post which I hold in your household. I shall be happy, however, to remain here until you have found some one to take over my duties." "Well, I am sorry it is come to this, and yet it may be that you are right," said he, with an expression of relief. "As to James, there need be no difficulty about that, for Dr. Patterson could come in to–morrow morning." "Then to–morrow morning let it be," I answered. "Very good, Dr. Munro. I will see that you have your cheque before you go." So there was the end of all my fine dreams about aristocratic practices and wonderful introductions. I believe the only person in the whole house who regretted me was Jimmy, who was quite downcast at the news. His grief, however, did not prevent him from brushing my new top hat the wrong way on the morning that I left. I did not notice it until I reached the station, and a most undignified object I must have looked when I took my departure. So ends the history of a failure. I am, as you know, inclined to fatalism, and do not believe that such a thing as chance exists, so I am bound to think that this experience was given to me for some end. It was a preliminary canter for the big race, perhaps. My mother was disappointed, but tried to show it as little as possible. My father was a little sardonic over the matter. I fear that the gap between us widens. By the way, an extraordinary card arrived from Cullingworth during my absence. "You are my man," said he. "Mind that I am to have you when I want you." There was no date and no address, but the postmark was Bradfield in the north of England. Does it mean nothing, or may it mean everything? We must wait and see. Good–bye, old man. Let me hear equally fully about your own affairs. How did the Rattray business go off? End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 5. Merton on the Moors, 5th March, 1882. I was so delighted, my dear chap, to have your assurance that nothing that I have said or could say upon the subject of religion could offend you. It is difficult to tell you how pleased and relieved I was at your cordial letter. I have no one to whom I can talk upon such matters. I am all driven inwards, and thought turns sour when one lets it stagnate like that. It is a grand thing to be able to tell it all to a sympathetic listener, and the more so, perhaps, when he looks at it all from another standpoint. It steadies and sobers one. Those whom I love best are those who have least sympathy with my struggles. They talk about having faith as if it could be done by an act of volition. They might as well tell me to have black hair instead of red. I might simulate it, perhaps, by refusing to use my reason at all in religious matters, but I will never be traitor to the highest thing that God has given me. I will use it. It is more moral to use it and go wrong than to forego it and be right. It is only a little foot rule, and I have to measure Mount Everest with it, but it's all I have, and I'll never give it up while there's breath between my lips. With all respect to you, Bertie, it is very easy to be orthodox. A man who wanted mental peace and material advancement in this world would certainly choose to be so. As Smiles says, a dead fish can float with the stream, but it takes a man to swim against it. What could be more noble than the start and the starter of Christianity? How beautiful the upward struggle of an idea, like some sweet flower blossoming out amongst rubble and cinders! But alas, to say that this idea was a final idea, that this scheme of thought was above the reason, that this gentle philosopher was that supreme intelligence to which we cannot even imagine a personality without irreverence, all this will come to rank with the strangest delusions of mankind. And then how clouded has become that fine daybreak of Christianity! Its representatives have risen from the manger to the palace, from the fishing smack to the House of Lords. Nor is that other old potentate in the Vatican, with his art treasures, his guards, and his cellars of wine, in a more logical position. They are all good and talented men, and in the market of brains are worth perhaps as much as they get. But how can they bring themselves to pose as the representatives of a creed which, as they themselves expound it, is based upon humility, poverty, and self-denial? Not one of them who would not quote with approval the parable of the wedding guest. But try putting one of them out of their due precedence at the next court reception. It happened some little time ago with a cardinal, and England rang with his protests. How blind not to see how they would spring at one leap into the real first place if they would but resolutely claim the last as the special badge of their master. What can we know? What are we all? Poor silly half-brained things peering out at the infinite with the aspirations of angels and the instincts of beasts. But surely all will be well with us. If not, then he who made us is evil, which is not to be thought. Surely then all must go very well with us. I feel ashamed when I read this over. My mind fills in all the trains of thought of which you have the rude ends peeping out from this tangle. Make what you can of it, dear Bertie, and believe that it all comes from my inmost heart. Above all, may I be kept from becoming a partisan, and tempering with truth in order to sustain a case. Let me but get a hand on her skirt, and she may drag me where she will, if she will but turn her face from time to time, that I may know her. You'll see from the address of this letter, Bertie, that I have left Scotland and am in Yorkshire. I have been here 3 months, and am now on the eve of leaving under the strangest circumstances, and with the queerest prospects. Good old Cullingworth has turned out a trump, as I always knew he would. But, as usual, I am beginning at the wrong end, so here goes to give you an idea of what has been happening. I told you in my last about my lunacy adventure and my ignominious return from Lochtully Castle. When I had settled for the flannel vests, which my mother had ordered so lavishly, I had only £5 left out of my pay. With this, as it was the first money that I had ever earned in my life, I bought her a gold bangle, so behold me reduced at once to my usual empty-pocketed condition. Well, it was something just to feel that I had earned money. It gave me an assurance that I might again. I had not been home for more than a few days when my father called me into the study after breakfast one morning, and spoke very seriously as to our financial position. He began the interview by unbuttoning his waistcoat, and asking me to listen at his 5th intercostal space 2 inches from the left sternal line. I did so, and was shocked to hear a well-marked mitral regurgitant murmur. "It is of old standing," said he, "but of late I have had a puffiness about the ankles, and some renal symptoms which show me that it is beginning to tell." I tried to express my grief and sympathy, but he cut me short with some asperity. "The point is," said he, "that no insurance office would accept my life, and that I have been unable, owing to competition and increased expenses, to lay anything by. If I die soon, which, between ourselves, is by no means improbable, I must leave to your care your mother and the children. My practice is so entirely a personal one that I cannot hope to be able to hand over to you enough to afford a living." I thought of Cullingworth's advice about going where you are least known. "I think," said I, "that my chances would be better away from here." "Then you must lose no time in establishing yourself," said he. "Your position would be one of great responsibility if anything were to happen to me just now. I had hoped that you had found an excellent opening with the Saltires, but I fear that you can hardly expect to get on in the world, my boy, if you insult your employer's religious and political view at his own table." It wasn't the time to argue, so I said nothing. My father took a copy of the Lancet out of his desk, and turned up an advertisement which he had marked with a blue pencil. "Read this," said he. "I've got it before me as I write. It runs thus: Qualified assistant, wanted at once in a large country and colliery practice. Thorough knowledge of obstetrics and dispensing indispensable. Ride and drive. £70 a year. Apply Dr. Horton, Merton on the Moors, Yorkshire." "There might be an opening there," said he. "I know Horton, and I'm convinced that I can get you the appointment. It would at least give you the opportunity of looking round and seeing whether there was any vacancy there. How do you think it would suit you?" Of course, I could only answer that I was willing to turn my hand to anything. But that interview has left a mark upon me, a heavy, ever-present gloom away at the back of my soul, which I am conscious of even when the cause of it has for a moment gone out of my thoughts. I had enough to make a man serious before, when I had to face the world without money or interest. But now to think of the mother and my sisters and little Paul all leaning upon me when I cannot stand myself, it is a nightmare. Could there be anything more dreadful in life than to have those whom you love looking for you to help, and to be unable to give it? But perhaps it won't come to that. Perhaps my father may hold his own for years. Come what may, I am bound to think that all things are ordered for the best, though when the good is a furlong off, and we with our beetle eyes can only see 3 inches, it takes some confidence in general principles to pull us through. Well, it was all fixed up, and down I came to Yorkshire. I wasn't in the best of spirits when I started, Bertie, but they went down and down as I neared my destination. How people can dwell in such places passes my comprehension. What can life offer them to make up for these mutilations of the face of nature? No woods, little grass, spouting chimneys, slate-coloured streams, sloping mounds of coke and slag, topped by the great wheels and pumps of the mines. Cinder-strewn paths, black as though stained by the weary miners who toil along them, lead through the tarnished fields to the rows of smoke-stained cottages. How can any young unmarried man accept such a lot, while there's an empty hammock in the navy, or a berth in the merchant forecastle? How many shillings a week is the breath of the ocean worth? It seems to me that if I were a poor man, well, upon my word, that if is rather funny when I think that many of the dwellers in those smoky cottages have twice my salary with half my expenses. Well, as I said, my spirits sank lower and lower until they got down into the bulb, when on looking through the gathering gloom I saw Merton printed on the lamps of a dreary, dismal station. I got out, and was standing beside my trunk and my hat-box, waiting for a porter, when up came a cheery-looking fellow, and asked me whether I was Dr. Stark Munro. "I'm Horton," said he, and shook hands cordially. In that melancholy place the sight of him was like a fire on a frosty night. He was gaily dressed in the first place, check trousers, white waistcoat, a flower in his buttonhole, but the look of the man was very much to my heart. He was ruddy-cheeked and black-eyed, with a jolly stout figure, and an honest genial smile. I felt as we clinched hands in the foggy, grimy station that I had met a man and a friend. His carriage was waiting, and we drove out to his residence, the Myrtles, where I was speedily introduced both to his family and his practice. The former is small, the latter enormous. The wife is dead, but her mother, Mrs. White, keeps house for him, and there are 2 dear little girls about 5 and 7. Then there is an unqualified assistant, a young Irish student, who, with the 3 maids, the coachman, and the stable-boy, make up the whole establishment. When I tell you that we give 4 horses quite as much as they can do, you will have an idea of the ground we cover. The house, a large square brick one, standing in its own grounds, is built on a small hill, in an oasis of green fields. Beyond this, however, on every side the veil of smoke hangs over the country, with the mine pumps and the chimneys bristling out of it. It would be a dreadful place for an idle man, but we are all so busy that we have hardly time to think about whether there's a view or not. Day and night we are at work, and yet the 3 months have been very pleasant ones to look back upon. I'll give you an idea of what a day's work is like. We breakfast about 9 o'clock, and immediately afterwards the morning patients begin to drop in. Many of them are very poor people, belonging to the colliery clubs, the principle of which is that the members pay a little over a halfpenny a week all the year round, well or ill, in return for which they get medicine and attendance free. Not much of a catch for the doctor, you would say, but it is astonishing what competition there is among them to get the appointment. You see, it is a certainty for one thing, and it leads indirectly to little other extras. Besides, it mounts up surprisingly. I have no doubt that Horton has 500 or 600 a year from his clubs alone. On the other hand, you can imagine that club patients, since they pay the same in any case, don't let their ailments go very far before they are round in the consulting room. Well then, by 9:30 we are in full blast. Horton is seeing the better patients in the consulting room, I am interviewing the poorer ones in the waiting room, and McCarthy, the Irishman, making up prescriptions as hard as he can tear. By the club rules, patients are bound to find their own bottles and corks. They generally remember the bottle, but always forget the cork. "You must pay a penny, or else put your forefinger in it," says McCarthy. They have an idea that all the strength of the medicine goes if the bottle is open, so they trot off with their fingers stuck in the necks. They have the most singular notions about medicines. "It's that strong that a spoon will stand up in it," is one man's description. Above all, they love to have 2 bottles, one with a solution of citric acid, and the other with carbonate of soda. When the mixture begins to fizz, they realise that there is indeed a science of medicine. This sort of work, with vaccinations, bandagings, and minor surgery, takes us to nearly 11 o'clock, when we assemble in Horton's room to make out the list. All the names of patients under treatment are pinned upon a big board. We sit round with the notebooks open, and distribute those who must be seen between us. By the time this is done and the horses in, it is 11:30. Then away we all fly upon our several tasks, Horton in a carriage and pair to see the employers, I in a dog-cart to see the employed, and McCarthy on his good Irish legs to see those chronic cases to which a qualified man can do no good, and an unqualified no harm. Well, we all work back again by 2 o'clock, when we find dinner waiting for us. We may or may not have finished our rounds. If not, away we go again. If we have, Horton dictates his prescriptions and strides off to bed, with his black clay pipe in his mouth. He is the most abandoned smoker I have ever met with, collecting the dottles of his pipes in the evening and smoking them the next morning before breakfast in the stable yard. When he has departed for his nap, McCarthy and I get to work on the medicine. There are perhaps 50 bottles to put up, with pills, ointments, etc. It is quite 4:30 before we have them all laid out on the shelf addressed to the respective invalids. Then we have an hour or so of quiet, when we smoke, or read, or box with the coachman in the harness room. After tea, the evening's work commences. From 6 to 9 people are coming in for their medicine, or fresh patients wishing advice. When these are settled, we have to see again any very grave cases which may be on the list, and so about 10 o'clock we may hope to have another smoke and perhaps a game of cards. Then it is a rare thing for a night to pass without one or other of us having to trudge off to a case which may take us 2 hours or may take us 10. Hard work, as you see, but Horton is such a good chap, and works so hard himself, that one does not mind what one does. And then we are all like brothers in the house. Our talk is just a rattle of chaff, and the patients are as homely as ourselves, so that the work becomes quite a pleasure to all of us. Yes, Horton is a real right-down good fellow. His heart is broad and kind and generous. There is nothing petty in the man. He loves to see those around him happy, and the sight of his sturdy figure and jolly red face goes far to make them so. Nature meant him to be a healer, for he brightens up a sick room as he did the Merton station when I first set eyes upon him. Don't imagine from my description that he is in any way soft, however. There is no one on whom one could be less likely to impose. He has a temper which is easily aflame, and as easily appeased. A mistake in the dispensing may wake it up, and then he bursts into the surgery like a whiff of cast wind, his cheeks red, his whiskers bristling, his eyes malignant. The day-book is banged, the bottles rattled, the counter thumped, and then he is off again with 5 doors slamming behind him. We can trace his progress when the black mood is on him by those dwindling slams. Perhaps it is that McCarthy has labelled the cough mixture as the eye wash, or sent an empty pill box with an exhortation to take one every 4 hours. In any case, the cyclone comes and goes, and by the next meal all is peace once more. I said that the patients were very homely. Anyone who is overstarched might well come here to be unstiffened. I confess that I did not quite fall in with it at once. When on one of my first mornings a club patient with his bottle under his arm came up to meet me, and asked if I were the doctor's man, I sent him on to see the groom in the stable. But soon one falls into the humour of it. There is no offence meant, and why should any be taken? They are kindly, generous folk, and if they pay no respect to your profession in the abstract, and so rather hurt your dignity, they will be as leal and true as possible to yourself, if you can win their respect. I like the grip of their greasy and blackened hands. Another peculiarity of the district is that many of the manufacturers and colliery owners have risen from the workmen, and have, in some cases at least, retained their old manners and even their old dress. The other day Mrs. White, Horton's mother-in-law, had a violent sick headache, and as we are all very fond of the kind old lady, we were trying to keep things as quiet as possible downstairs. Suddenly there came a bang, bang, bang at the knocker, and then in an instant another rattling series of knocks, as if a tethered donkey were trying to kick in the panel. After all our efforts for silence, it was exasperating. I rushed to the door to find a seedy-looking person just raising his hand to commence a fresh bombardment. "What on earth's the matter?" I asked, only I may have been a little more emphatic. "Pain in the jaw," said he. "You needn't make such a noise," said I. "Other people are ill besides you." "If I pay my money, young man, I'll make as much noise as I like." And actually in cold blood he commenced a fresh assault upon the door. He would have gone on with his devil's tattoo all morning if I had not led him down the path and seen him off the premises. An hour afterwards Horton whirled into the surgery with a trail of banged doors behind him. "What's this about Mr. Usher, Munro?" he said. "He says that you are violent towards him." "There was a club patient here who kept on banging the knocker," said I. "I was afraid that he would disturb Mrs. White, and so I made him stop." Horton's eyes began to twinkle. "My boy," said he, "that club patient, as you call him, is the richest man in Merton, and worth 100 a year to me." I have no doubt that he appeased him by some tale of my disgrace and degradation, but I have not heard anything of the matter since. It has been good for me to be here, Bertie. It has brought me in close contact with the working classes, and made me realise what fine people they are. Because one drunkard goes home howling on a Saturday night, we are too apt to overlook the 99 decent folk by their own firesides. I shall not make that mistake any more. The kindliness of the poor to the poor makes a man sick of himself, and their sweet patience. Depend upon it, if ever there is a popular rising, the wrongs which lead to it must be monstrous and indefensible. I think the excesses of the French Revolution are dreadful enough in themselves, but much more so as an index to the slow centuries of misery against which they were a mad protest. And then the wisdom of the poor! It is amusing to read the glib newspaper man writing about the ignorance of the masses. They don't know the date of the Magna Carta, or who John of Gaunt married, but put a practical, up-to-date problem before them, and see how unerringly they take the right side. Didn't they put the Reform Bill through in the teeth of the opposition of the majority of the so-called educated classes? Didn't they back the North against the South when nearly all our leaders went wrong? When universal arbitration and the suppression of the liquor traffic comes, is it not sure to be from the pressure of these humble folks? They look at life with clearer and more unselfish eyes. It's an axiom, I think, that to heighten a nation's wisdom you must lower its franchise. I often have my doubts, Bertie, if there is such a thing as the existence of evil. If we could honestly convince ourselves that there was not, it would help us so much in formulating a rational religion. But don't let us strain truth even for such an object as that. I must confess that there are some forms of vice, cruelty for example, for which it is hard to find any explanation, save indeed that it is a degenerate survival of that warlike ferocity which may once have been of service in helping to protect the community. No, let me be frank and say that I can't make cruelty fit into my scheme. But when you find that other evils, which seem at first sight black enough, really tend in the long run to the good of mankind, it may be hoped that those which continue to puzzle us may at last be found to serve the same end in some fashion which is now inexplicable. It seems to me that the study of life by the physician vindicates the moral principles of right and wrong. But when you look closely, it is a question whether that which is a wrong to the present community may not prove to have been a right to the interest of posterity. That sounds a little foggy, but I will make my meaning more clear when I say that I think right and wrong are both tools which are being wielded by those great hands which are shaping the destinies of the universe, that both are making for improvement, but that the action of the one is immediate, and that of the other more slow, but none the less certain. Our own distinction of right and wrong is founded too much upon the immediate convenience of the community, and does not inquire sufficiently deeply into the ultimate effect. I have my own views about nature's methods, though I feel that it is rather like a beetle giving his opinions upon the Milky Way. However, they have the merit of being consoling, for if we could conscientiously see that sin served a purpose, and a good one, it would take some of the blackness out of life. It seems to me, then, that nature, still working on the lines of evolution, strengthens the race in two ways. The one is by improving those who are morally strong, which is done by increased knowledge and broadening religious views. The other, and hardly less important, is by the killing off and extinction of those who are morally weak. This is accomplished by drink and immorality. These are really two of the most important forces which work for the ultimate perfection of the race. I picture them as two great invisible hands hovering over the garden of life and plucking up the weeds. Looked at in one's own day, one can only see that they produce degradation and misery. But at the end of a third generation from then, what has happened? The line of the drunkard and of the debauchee, physically as well as morally weakened, is either extinct or on the way towards it. Struma, tubercle, nervous disease have all lent a hand towards the pruning off of that rotten branch, and the average of the race is thereby improved. I believe, from the little that I have seen of life, that it is a law which acts with startling swiftness, that a majority of drunkards never perpetuate their species at all, and that when the curse is hereditary, the second generation generally sees the end of it. Don't misunderstand me, and quote me as saying that it is a good thing for a nation that it should have many drunkards. Nothing of the kind. What I say is that if a nation has many morally weak people, then it is good that there should be a means for checking those weaker strains. Nature has her devices, and drink is among them. When there are no more drunkards and reprobates, it means that the race is so advanced that it no longer needs such rough treatment. Then the all-wise engineer will speed us along in some other fashion. I've been thinking a good deal lately about this question of the uses of evil, and of how powerful a tool it is in the hands of the Creator. Last night the whole thing crystallized out quite suddenly into a small set of verses. Please jump them if they bore you. With either hand. God's own best will bide the test, and God's own worst will fall. But best or worst, or last or first, He ordereth it all. For all is good if understood. Ah, could we understand! And right and ill are tools of skill held in His either hand. The harlot and the anchorite, the martyr and the rake, deftly He fashions each aright its vital part to take. Wisdom He makes to guide the sap where the high blossoms be, and lust to kill the weaker branch, and drink to trim the tree. And holiness that so the bowl be solid at the core, and plague and fever that the whole be changing evermore. He strews the microbes in the lung, the blood clot in the brain. With test and test He picks the best, then tests them once again. He tests the body and the mind, He rings them o'er and o'er, and if they crack He throws them back and fashions them once more. He chokes the infant throat with slime, he sets the ferment free, he builds the tiny tube of lime that blocks the artery. He lets the youthful dreamer store great projects in his brain, until he drops the fungus spore that smears them out again. He stores the milk that feeds the babe, he dulls the tortured nerve, he gives 100 joys of sense where few or none might serve. And still he trains the branch of good where the high blossoms be, and wieldeth still the shears of ill to prune and prune his tree. So I read this, and as I try to write it clear again, I feel a second finger lie above mine on the pen. Dim are these peering eyes of mine, and dark what I have seen. But be I wrong, the wrong is thine, else had it never been. I am quite ashamed of having been so didactic, but it is fine to think that sin may have an object and work towards good. My father says that I seem to look upon the universe as if it were my property, and can't be happy until I know that all is right with it. Well, it does send a glow through me when I seem to catch a glimpse of the light behind the clouds. And now for my big bit of news, which is going to change my whole life. Whom do you think I had a letter from last Tuesday week? From Cullingworth, no less. It had no beginning, no end, and was addressed all wrong, and written with a very thick quill pen upon the back of a prescription. How it ever reached me is a wonder. This is what he had to say. Started here in Bradfield last June. Colossal success. My example must revolutionize medical practice. Rapidly making fortune. Have invention which is worth millions. Unless our Admiralty take it up, shall make Brazil the leading naval power. Come down by next train on receiving this. Have plenty for you to do. That was the whole of this extraordinary letter. It had no name to it, which was certainly reasonable enough, since no one else could have written it. Knowing Cullingworth as well as I did, I took it with reservations and deductions. How could he have made so rapid and complete a success in a town in which he must have been a complete stranger? It was incredible, and yet there must be some truth in it, or he would not invite me to come down and test it. On the whole, I thought that I had better move very cautiously in the matter, for I was happy and snug where I was, and kept on putting a little by, which I hoped would form a nucleus to start me in practice. It is only a few pounds up to date, but in a year or so it might amount to something. I wrote to Cullingworth, therefore, thanking him for having remembered me, and explaining how matters stood. I had had great difficulty in finding an opening, I said, and now that I had one, I was loath to give it up, save for a permanency. 10 days passed, during which Cullingworth was silent. Then came a huge telegram. Your letter to hand. Why not call me a liar at once? I tell you that I have seen 30,000 patients in the last year. My actual takings have been over £4,000. All patients come to me. Would not cross the street to see Queen Victoria. You can have all visiting, all surgery, all midwifery. Make what you like of it. Will guarantee £300 the first year. Well, this began to look more like business, especially that last sentence. I took it to Horton and asked his advice. His opinion was that I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. So it ended by my wiring back accepting the partnership, if it is a partnership, and tomorrow morning I am off to Bradfield with great hopes and a small portmanteau. I know how interested you are in the personality of Cullingworth, as every one is who comes even at second hand within range of his influence. And so you may rely upon it that I shall give you a very full and particular account of all that passes between us. I am looking forward immensely to seeing him again, and I trust we won't have any rows. Good-bye, old chap. My foot is upon the threshold of fortune. Congratulate me. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Jackson. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 6. The Parade. Bradfield, 7th March, 1882. It is only 2 days since I wrote to you, my dear old chap, and yet I find myself loaded to the muzzle, and at full cock again. I have come to Bradfield. I have seen old Cullingworth once more, and I have found that all he has told me is true. Yes, incredible as it sounded, this wonderful fellow seems to have actually built up a great practice in little more than a year. He really is, with all his eccentricities, a very remarkable man, Bertie. He doesn't seem to have a chance of showing his true powers in this matured civilization. The law and custom hamper him. He is the sort of fellow who would come right to the front in a French Revolution. Or if you put him as emperor over some of these little South American states, I believe that in 10 years he would either be in his grave or would have the continent. Yes, Cullingworth is fit to fight for a higher stake than a medical practice, and on a bigger stage than an English provincial town. When I read of Aaron Burr in your history, I always picture him as a man like C. I had the kindest of leave-takings from Horton. If he had been my brother, he could not have been more affectionate. I could not have thought that I should grow so fond of a man in so short a time. He takes the keenest interest in my venture, and I am to write him a full account. He gave me, as we parted, a black old meerschaum, which he had colored himself, the last possible pledge of affection from a smoker. It was pleasant for me to feel that if all went wrong at Bradfield, I had a little harbor at Merton for which I could make. Still, of course, pleasant and instructive as the life there was, I could not shut my eyes to the fact that it would take a terribly long time before I could save enough to buy a share in a practice, a longer time probably than my poor father's strength would last. That telegram of Cullingworth's, in which, as you may remember, he guaranteed me £300 in the first year, gave me hopes of a much more rapid career. You will agree with me, I am sure, that I did wisely to go to him. I had an adventure upon the way to Bradfield. The carriage in which I was traveling contained a party of 3, at whom I took the most casual of glances before settling down to the daily paper. There was an elderly lady with a bright rosy face, gold spectacles, and a dash of red velvet in her bonnet. With her were 2 younger people, who I took to be her son and her daughter, the one a quiet, gentle-looking girl of 20 or so, dressed in black, and the other a short, thick-set young fellow a year or 2 older. The 2 ladies sat by each other in the far corner, and the son, as I presume him to be, sat opposite me. We may have traveled an hour or more without my paying any attention to this little family party, save that I could not help hearing some talk between the 2 ladies. The younger, who was addressed as Winnie, had, as I noticed, a very sweet and soothing voice. She called the elder mother, which showed that I was right as to the relationship. I was sitting then, still reading my paper, when I was surprised to get a kick on the shins from the young fellow opposite. I moved my legs, thinking that it was an accident, but an instant afterwards I received another and a harder one. I dropped my paper with a growl, but the moment that I glanced at him, I saw how the matter stood. His foot was jerking spasmodically, his 2 hands clenched and drumming against his breast, while his eyes were rolling upwards until only the rim of his iris was to be seen. I sprang upon him, tore open his collar, unbuttoned his waistcoat, and pulled his head down upon the seat. Crash went one of his heels through the carriage window, but I contrived to sit upon his knees while I kept hold of his 2 wrists. "Don't be alarmed," I cried. "It's epilepsy, and will soon pass." Glancing up, I saw that the little girl was sitting very pale and quiet in the corner. The mother had pulled a bottle out of her bag and was quite cool and helpful. "He often has them," says she. "This is bromide." "He's coming out," I answered. "You look after Winnie." I blurted it out because her head seemed to rock as if she were going off, but the absurdity of the thing struck us all next moment, and the mother burst into a laugh in which the daughter and I joined. The son had opened his eyes and had ceased to struggle. "I must really beg your pardon," said I, as I helped him up again. "I had not the advantage of knowing your other name, and I was in such a hurry that I had no time to think what I was saying." They laughed again in the most good-humored way, and as soon as the young fellow had recovered, we all joined in quite a confidential conversation. It is wonderful how the intrusion of any of the realities of life brushes away the cobwebs of etiquette. In half an hour we knew all about each other, or at any rate I knew all about them. Mrs. LaForce was the mother's name, a widow with these 2 children. They had given up housekeeping and found it more pleasant to live in apartments, traveling from one watering place to another. Their one trouble was the nervous weakness of the son Fred. They were now on their way to Birchespool, where they hoped that he might get some good from the bracing air. I was able to recommend vegetarianism, which I had found to act like a charm in such cases. We had quite a spirited conversation, and I think that we were sorry on both sides when we came to the junction where they had to change. Mrs. LaForce gave me her card, and I promised to call if ever I should be in Birchespool. However, all this must be stupid enough to you. You know my little ways by this time, and you don't expect me to keep on the main line of my story. However, I am back on the rails now, and I shall try to remain there. Well, it was nearly 6 o'clock, and the evening was just creeping in when we drew up in Bradfield Station. The first thing I saw when I looked out of the window was Cullingworth, exactly the same as ever, striding in his jerky way down the platform, his coat flying open, his chin thrust forward. He is the most underhung man I have ever seen, and his great teeth all gleaming like a good-natured bloodhound. He roared with delight when he saw me, wrung my hand, and slapped me enthusiastically upon the shoulder. "My dear chap," said he, "we'll clear this town out. I tell you, Munro, we won't leave a doctor in it. It's all they can do now to get butter to their bread, and when we get to work together, they'll have to eat it dry. Listen to me, my boy. There are 120,000 folk in this town, and all shrieking for advice, and there isn't a doctor who knows a rhubarb pill from a calculus. Man, we only have to gather them in. I stand and take the money until my arm aches." "But how is it?" I asked as we pushed our way through the crowd. "Are there so few other doctors?" "Few!" he roared. "By crumbs, the streets are blocked with them. You couldn't fall out of a window in this town without killing a doctor. But of all you'll see them for yourself. You walked to my house at Avonmouth, Munro. I don't let my friends walk to my house at Bradfield, what?" A well-appointed carriage with 2 fine black horses was drawn up at the station entrance. The smart coachman touched his hat as Cullingworth opened the door. "Which of the houses, sir?" he asked. Cullingworth's eyes shot round to me to see what I thought of such a query. Between ourselves, I have not the slightest doubt that he had instructed the man to ask it. He always had a fine eye for effect, but he usually erred by underrating the intelligence of those around him. "Ah," said he, rubbing his chin like a man in doubt. "Well, I dare say dinner will be nearly ready. Drive to the town residential." "Good gracious, Cullingworth," said I as we started. "How many houses do you inhabit? It sounds as if you had bought the town." "Well, well," said he, laughing, "we are driving to the house where I usually live. It suits us very well, though I have not been able to get all the rooms furnished yet. Then I have a little farm of a few hundred acres just outside the city. It is a pleasant place for the week-ends, and we send the nurse and the child." "My dear chap, I did not know that you had started a family." "Yes, it's an infernal nuisance, but still the fact remains. We get our butter and things from the farm. Then, of course, I have my house of business in the heart of the city." "Consulting and waiting room, I suppose?" He looked at me with a sort of half-vexed, half-amused expression. "You cannot rise to a situation, Munro," said he. "I never met a fellow with such a stodgy imagination. I trust you to describe a thing when you have seen it, but never to build up an idea of it beforehand." "What's the trouble now?" I asked. "Well, I have written to you about my practice, and I've wired to you about it, and here you sit asking me if I work it in 2 rooms. I'll have to hire the market square before I've finished, and then I won't have space to wag my elbows. Can your imagination rise to a great house with people waiting in every room, jammed in as tight as they'll fit, and 2 layers of them squatting in the cellar? Well, that's my house of business on an average day. The folk come in from the country 50 miles off, and eat bread and treacle on the doorstep, so as to be first in when the housekeeper comes down. The medical officer of health made an official complaint of the overcrowding of my waiting rooms. They wait in the stables, and sit along the racks, and under the horses' bellies. I'll turn some of them on to you, my boy, and then you'll know a little more about it." Well, all this puzzled me a good deal, as you can imagine, Bertie, for making every allowance for Cullingworth's inflated way of talking, there must be something at the back of it. I was thinking to myself that I must keep my head cool and have a look at everything with my own eyes, when the carriage pulled up and we got out. "This is my little place," said Cullingworth. It was the corner house of a line of fine buildings, and looked to me much more like a good-sized hotel than a private mansion. It had a broad sweep of steps leading to the door, and towered away up to 5 or 6 stories, with pinnacles and a flagstaff on the top. As a matter of fact, I learned that before Cullingworth took it, it had been one of the chief clubs in the town, but the committee had abandoned it on account of the heavy rent. A smart maid opened the door, and a moment later I was shaking hands with Mrs. Cullingworth, who was all kindliness and cordiality. She has, I think, forgotten the little Avonmouth business when her husband and I fell out. The inside of the house was even huger than I had thought from the look of the exterior. There were over 30 bedrooms, Cullingworth informed me, as he helped me to carry my portmanteau upstairs. The hall and first stair were most excellently furnished and carpeted, but it all run to nothing at the landing. My own bedroom had a little iron bed, and a small basin standing on a packing case. Cullingworth took a hammer from the mantelpiece and began to knock in nails behind the door. "These will do to hang your clothes on," said he. "You don't mind roughing it a little until we get things in order?" "Not in the least." "You see," he explained, "there's no good my putting a 40-pound suite into a bedroom, and then having to chuck it all out of the window in order to make room for a 100-pound one. No sense in that, Munro. Eh, what? I'm going to furnish this house as no house has ever been furnished, by crumbs. I'll bring the folk from 100 miles round just to have leave to look at it, but I must do it room by room. Come down with me and look at the dining room. You must be hungry after your journey." It really was furnished in a marvelous way, nothing flash and everything magnificent. The carpet was so rich that my feet seemed to sink into it as into deep moss. The soup was on the table, and Mrs. Cullingworth sitting down, but he kept hauling me round to look at something else. "Go on, Hetty," he cried over his shoulder. "I just want to show Munro this. Now, these plain dining-room chairs, what do you think they cost each? Eh, what?" £5, said I at a venture. "Exactly," he cried in great delight. £30 for the 6. You hear, Hetty? Munro guessed the price first shot. Now, my boy, what for the pair of curtains?" They were a magnificent pair of stamped crimson velvet, with a 2-foot gilt cornice above them. I thought that I had better not imperil my newly gained reputation by guessing. £80, he roared, slapping them with the back of his hand. £80, Munro. What do you think of that? Everything that I have in this house is going to be of the best. Why, look at this waiting maid. Did you ever see a neater one?" He swung the girl towards me by the arm. "Don't be silly, Jimmy," said Mrs. Cullingworth mildly, while he roared with laughter, with all his fangs flashing under his bristling mustache. The girl edged closer to her mistress, looking half frightened and half angry. "All right, Mary, no harm," he cried. "Sit down, Munro, old chap. Get a bottle of champagne, Mary, and we'll drink to more luck. Well, we had a very pleasant little dinner. It is never slow if Cullingworth is about. He is one of those men who make a kind of magnetic atmosphere, so that you feel exhilarated and stimulated in their presence. His mind is so nimble and his thoughts so extravagant that your own break away from their usual grooves, and surprise you by their activity. You feel pleased at your own inventiveness and originality, when you are really like the wren when it took a lift on the eagle's shoulder. Old Peterson, you remember, used to have a similar effect upon you in the Linlithgow days. In the middle of the dinner he plunged off, and came back with a round bag, about the size of a pomegranate, in his hand. "What do you think this is, Munro, eh?" "I have no idea." "Our day's take, eh, Eddie?" He undid a string, and in an instant a pile of gold and silver rattled down upon the cloth, the coins whirling and clinking among the dishes. One rolled off the table and was retrieved by the maid from some distant corner. "What is it, Mary, a half-sovereign? Put it in your pocket. What did the lot come to, Hetty?" £31.8. "You see, Munro, one day's work." He plunged his hand into his trouser pocket and brought out a pile of sovereigns, which he balanced in his palm. "Look at that, laddie. Rather different from my Avonmouth form, eh, what?" "It will be good news for them," I suggested. He was scowling at me in an instant with all his old ferocity. You cannot imagine a more savage-looking creature than Cullingworth is when his temper goes wrong. He gets a perfectly fiendish expression in his light blue eyes, and all his hair bristles up like a striking cobra. He isn't a beauty at his best, but at his worst he's really phenomenal. At the first danger signal his wife had ordered the maid from the room. "What rot you do talk, Munro," he cried. "Do you suppose I'm going to cripple myself for years by letting those debts hang on to me?" "I understood that you had promised," said I. "Still, of course, it is no business of mine." "I should hope not," he cried. "A tradesman stands to win or to lose. He allows a margin for bad debts. I would have paid it if I could. I couldn't, and so I wiped the slate clean. No one in his senses would dream of spending all the money that I make in Bradfield upon the tradesmen of Avonmouth. Suppose they come down upon you. Well, we'll see about that when they do. Meanwhile, I'm paying ready money for every mortal thing that comes up the doorsteps. They think so well of me here that I could have had the whole place furnished like a palace from the drain pipes to the flagstaff, only I determined to take each room in turn when I was ready for it. There's nearly 400 pounds under this one ceiling. There came a tap at the door, and in walked a boy in buttons. If you please, sir, Mr. Duncan wishes to see you. Give my compliments to Mr. Duncan, and tell him he may go to the devil. My dear Jimmy, cried Mrs. Cullingworth, tell him I am at dinner, and if all the kings in Europe were waiting in the hall with their crowns in their hands, I wouldn't cross that door mat to see them. The boy vanished, but was back in an instant. Please, sir, he won't go. Won't go? What do you mean? Cullingworth sat with his mouth open, and his knife and fork sticking up. What do you mean, you brat? What are you boggling about? It's his bill, sir, said the frightened boy. Cullingworth's face grew dusky, and the veins began to swell on his forehead. His bill, Look here. He took his watch out and laid it on the table. It's 2 minutes to 8. At 8 I'm coming out, and if I find him there I'll strew the street with him. Tell him I'll shred him over the parish. He has 2 minutes to save his life in, and one of them is nearly gone. The boy bolted from the room, and in an instant afterwards we heard the bang of the front door, with a clatter of steps down the stairs. Cullingworth lay back in his chair and roared until the tears shone on his eyelashes, while his wife quivered all over with sympathetic merriment. I'll drive him mad, Cullingworth sobbed at last. He's a nervous, chicken-livered kind of man, and when I look at him he turns the color of putty. If I pass his shop, I usually just drop in and stand and look at him. I never speak, but just look. It paralyzes him. Sometimes the shop is full of people, but it is just the same. Who is he, then? I asked. He's my corn merchant. I was saying that I paid my tradesmen as I go, but he is the only exception. He has done me once or twice, you see, and so I try to take it out of him. By the way, you might send him down 20 pounds tomorrow, Hetty. It's time for an installment. What a gossip you will think me, Bertie, but when I begin, my memory brings everything back so clearly, and I write on and on almost unconsciously. Besides, this fellow is such a mixture of qualities that I could never give you any idea of him by myself. And so I just try to repeat to you what he says and what he does, so that you may build up your own picture of the man. I know that he has always interested you, and that he does so more now than ever since our fates have drawn us together again. After dinner, we went into the back room, which was the most extraordinary contrast to the front one, having only a plain deal table and a half a dozen kitchen chairs scattered about on a linoleum floor. At one end was an electric battery and a big magnet. At the other a packing case with several pistols and a litter of cartridges upon it. A rook rifle was leaning tip against it, and looking round I saw that the walls were all pocked with bullet marks. "What's this, then?" I asked, rolling my eyes round. "Hetty, what's this?" he asked with his pipe in his hand and his head cocked sideways. "Naval supremacy and the command of the seas," said she, like a child repeating a lesson. "That's it," he shouted, stabbing at me with the amber. "Naval supremacy and command of the seas. It's all here right under your nose, I tell you, Munro. I could go to Switzerland tomorrow, and I could say to them, 'Look here, you haven't got a seaboard, and you haven't got a port, but just find me a ship and hoist your flag on it, and I'll give you every ocean under heaven.' I'd sweep the seas until there wasn't a matchbox floating on them. Or I could make them over to a limited company, and join the board after allotment. I hold the salt water in the cup of this hand, every drop of it." His wife put her hands on his shoulder with admiration in her eyes. I turned to knock out my pipe and grinned over the grate. "Oh, you may grin," said he. He was wonderfully quick at spotting what you were doing. "You'll grin a little wider when you see the dividends coming in. What's the value of that magnet?" £1. 1,000,000 pounds, not a penny under. And dirt cheap to the nation that buys it. I shall let it go at that, though I could make 10 times as much if I held on. I shall take it up to the Secretary of the Navy in a week or two, and if he seems to be a civil, deserving sort of person, I shall do business with him. It is not every day, Munro, that a man comes into his office with the Atlantic under one arm and the Pacific under the other. Eh, what? I knew it would make him savage, but I lay back in my chair and laughed until I was tired. His wife looked at me reproachfully, but he, after a moment of blackness, burst out laughing also, stamping up and down the room and waving his arms. "Of course it seems absurd to you," he cried. "Well, I dare say it would be to me if any other fellow had worked it out. But you may take my word for it that it's all right. Hetty here will answer for it, won't you, Hetty? It's splendid, my dear. Now I'll show you, Munro, what an unbelieving Jew you are, trying to look interested and giggling at the back of your throat. In the first place, I have discovered a method, which I won't tell you, of increasing the attractive power of a magnet 100-fold. Have you grasped that? Yes. Very good. You are also aware, I presume, that modern projectiles are either made of or tipped with steel. It may possibly have come to your ears that magnets attract steel. Permit me now to show you a small experiment." He bent over his apparatus, and I suddenly heard the snapping of electricity. This, he continued, going across to the packing case, is a saloon pistol, and will be exhibited in the museums of the next century as being the weapon with which the new era was inaugurated. Into the breech I place a boxer cartridge, specially provided for experimental purposes with a steel bullet. I aim point blank at the dab of red sealing wax upon the wall, which is 4 inches above the magnet. I am an absolutely dead shot. I fire. You will now advance and satisfy yourself that the bullet is flattened upon the end of the magnet, after which you will apologize to me for that grin. I looked, and it certainly was as he had said. "I'll tell you what I would do," he cried. "I am prepared to put that magnet in Hetty's bonnet, and to let you fire 6 shots straight at her face. How's that for a test? You wouldn't mind, Hetty, eh, what?" I don't think she would have objected, but I hastened to disclaim any share in such an experiment. "Of course, you see that the whole thing is to scale. My warship of the future carries at her prow and stern a magnet which shall be as much larger than that as the big shell will be larger than this tiny bullet. Or I might have a separate raft, possibly, to carry my apparatus. My ship goes into action. What happens then, Munro? Eh, what? Every shot fired at her goes smack onto the magnet. There's a reservoir below into which they drop when the electric circuit is broken. After every action they are sold by auction for old metal, and the result divided as prize money among the crew. But think of it, man. I tell you it is an absolute impossibility for a shot to strike any ship which is provided with my apparatus. And then look at the cheapness. You don't want armor, you want nothing. Any ship that floats becomes invulnerable with one of these. The warship of the future will cost anything from £7.10. You're grinning again, but if you give me a magnet and a Brixton trawler with a 7-pounder gun, I'll show sport to the finest battleship afloat. Well, there must be some flaw about this, I suggested. If your magnet is so strong as all that, you would have your own broadside boomeranging back upon you. Not a bit of it. There's a big difference between a shot flying away from you with all its muzzle velocity and another one which is coming towards you and only needs a slight deflection to strike the magnet. Besides, by breaking the circuit, I can take off the influence when I'm firing my own broadside. Then I connect and instantly become invulnerable. And your nails and screws? The warship of the future will be bolted together by wood. Well, he would talk of nothing else the whole evening but of this wonderful invention of his. Perhaps there is nothing in it. Probably there is not. And yet it illustrates the many-sided nature of the man. That he should not say one word about his phenomenal success here, of which I am naturally most anxious to hear. Not a word either upon the important subject of our partnership, but will think and talk of nothing but this extraordinary naval idea. In a week he will have tossed it aside in all probability, and be immersed in some plan for reuniting the Jews and settling them in Madagascar. Yet from all he has said and all I have seen, there can be no doubt that he has in some inexplicable way made a tremendous hit, and tomorrow I shall let you know all about it. Come what may, I am delighted that I came, for things promise to be interesting. Regard this not as the end of a letter, but of a paragraph. You shall have the conclusion tomorrow or on Thursday at the latest. Goodbye, and my remembrance to Lawrence if you see him. How's your friend from Yale? End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 7. The Parade, Bradfield, 9th March, 1882. Well, you see I am as good as my word, Bertie, and here is a full account of this queer little sample gouged out of real life, never to be seen, I should fancy, by any eye save your own. I have written to Horton also, and of course to my mother, but I don't go into detail with them, as I have got into the way of doing with you. You keep on assuring me that you like it, so on your own head be it if you find my experiences gradually developing into a weariness. When I woke in the morning and looked round at the bare walls and the basin on the packing case, I hardly knew where I was. Collingworth came charging into the room in his dressing-gown, however, and roused me effectually by putting his hands on the rail at the end of the bed, and throwing a somersault over it, which brought his heels onto my pillow with a thud. He was in great spirits, and, squatting on the bed, he held forth about his plans while I dressed. "I will tell you one of the first things I mean to do, Munro," said he. "I mean to have a paper of my own. We'll start a weekly paper here, you and I, and we'll make them sit up all round. We'll have an organ of our own, just like every French politician. If anyone crosses us, we'll make them wish they had never been born. Eh, what, laddie? What do you think? So clever, Munro, that everybody's bound to read it, and so scathing that it will just fetch out blisters every time. Don't you think we could?" "What politics?" I asked. "Oh, curse the politics. Red pepper well rubbed in, that's my idea of a paper. Call it the Scorpion. Chaff the mayor and the council until they call a meeting and hang themselves. I'd do the snappy paragraphs, and you would do the fiction and poetry. I thought about it during the night, and Hetty has written to Murdoch's to get an estimate for the printing. We might get our first number out this day week." "My dear chap," I gasped. "I want you to start a novel this morning. You won't get many patients at first, and you'll have lots of time." "But I never wrote a line in my life." "A properly balanced man can do anything he sets his hand to. He's got every possible quality inside him, and all he wants is the will to develop it." "Could you write a novel yourself?" I asked. "Of course I could. Such a novel, Munro, that when they'd read the first chapter the folk would just sit groaning until the second came out. They'd wait in rows outside my door in the hope of hearing what was coming next. By crumbs, I'll go and begin it now." And with another somersault over the end of the bed, he rushed from the room with the tassels of his dressing-gown flying behind him. I dare say you've quite come to the conclusion by this time that Collingworth is simply an interesting pathological study, a man in the first stage of lunacy or general paralysis. You might not be so sure about it if you were in close contact with him. He justifies his wildest flights by what he does. It sounds grotesque when put down in black and white, but then it would have sounded equally grotesque a year ago if he had said that he would build up a huge practice in a 12-month. Now we see that he has done it. His possibilities are immense. He has such huge energy at the back of his fertility of invention. I am afraid, on thinking over all I have written to you, that I may have given you a false impression of the man by dwelling too much on those incidents in which he has shown the strange and violent side of his character, and omitting the sketches between where his wisdom and judgment have had a chance. His conversation, when he does not fly off at a tangent, is full of pith and idea. "The greatest monument ever erected to Napoleon Bonaparte was the British national debt," said he yesterday. Again, "We must never forget that the principal export of Great Britain to the United States is the United States." Again, speaking of Christianity, "What is intellectually unsound cannot be morally sound." He shoots off a whole column of aphorisms in a single evening. I should like to have a man with a notebook always beside him to gather up his waste. No, you must not let me give you a false impression of the man's capacity. On the other hand, it would be dishonest to deny that I think him thoroughly unscrupulous, and full of very sinister traits. I am much mistaken, however, if he has not a fine strata in his nature. He is capable of rising to heights as well as sinking to depths. Well, when we had breakfasted, we got into the carriage and drove off to the place of business. "I suppose you are surprised at Hetty coming with us," said Collingworth, slapping me on the knee. "Hetty, Munro is wondering what the devil you are here for, only he is too polite to ask. In fact, it had struck me as rather strange that she should, as a matter of course, accompany us to business. You'll see when we get there," he cried, chuckling. "We run this affair on lines of our own." It was not very far, and we soon found ourselves outside a square whitewashed building, which had a huge Dr. Collingworth on a great brass plate at the side of the door. Underneath was printed, "May be consulted gratis from 10 to 4." The door was opened, and I caught a glimpse of a crowd of people waiting in the hall. "How many here?" asked Cullingworth of the page boy. 140, sir." "All the waiting rooms full?" "Yes, sir." "Courtyard full?" "Yes, sir." "Stable full?" "Yes, sir." "Coach house full?" "There's still room in the coach house, sir." "Ah, I'm sorry we haven't got a crowded day for you, Munro," said he. "Of course we can't command these things, and must take them as they come. Now then, make a gangway, can't you?" This to his patients. "Come here and see the waiting room. Pooh, what an atmosphere! Why on earth can't you open the windows for yourselves? I never saw such folk. There are 30 people in this room, Munro, and not one with sense enough to open a window to save himself from suffocation." "I tried, sir, but there's a screw through the sash," cried one fellow. "Ah, my boy, you'll never get on in the world if you can't open a window without raising a sash," said Cullingworth, slapping him on the shoulder. He took the man's umbrella and stuck it through 2 of the panes of glass. "That's the way," he said. "Boy, see that the screw is taken out. Now then, Munro, come along and we'll get to work." We went up a wooden stair, uncarpeted, leaving every room beneath us, as far as I could see, crowded with patients. At the top was a bare passage which had 2 rooms opposite to each other at one end, and a single one at the other. "This is my consulting room," said he, leading the way into one of these. It was a good-sized square chamber, perfectly empty save for 2 plain wooden chairs and an unpainted table with 2 books and a stethoscope upon it. It doesn't look like 4,000 or 5,000 a year, does it? Now, there's an exactly similar one opposite, which you can have for yourself. I'll send across any surgical cases which may turn up. Today, however, I think you had better stay with me and see how I work things." "I should very much like to," said I. "There are 1 or 2 elementary rules to be observed in the way of handling patients," he remarked, seating himself on the table and swinging his legs. "The most obvious is that you must never let them see that you want them. It should be pure condescension on your part seeing them at all, and the more difficulties you throw in the way of it, the more they think of it. Break your patients in early, and keep them well to heal. Never make the fatal mistake of being polite to them. Many foolish young men fall into this habit and are ruined in consequence. Now, this is my form." He sprang to the door, and putting his 2 hands to his mouth, he bellowed, "Stop your confounded jabbering down there. I might as well be living above a poultry show. There, you see," he added to me. "They will think ever so much more of me for that." "But don't they get offended?" I asked. "I'm afraid not. I have a name for this sort of thing now, and they have come to expect it. But an offended patient, I mean a thoroughly insulted one, is the finest advertisement in the world. If it is a woman, she runs clacking about among her friends until your name becomes a household word, and they all pretend to sympathize with her and agree among themselves that you must be a remarkably discerning man. I quarreled with one man about the state of his gall duct, and it ended by my throwing him down the stairs. What was the result? He talked so much about it that the whole village from which he came, sick and well, trooped to see me. The little country practitioner who had been buttering them up for a quarter of a century found that he might as well put up his shutters. It's human nature, my boy, and you can't alter it. Eh, what? You make yourself cheap and you become cheap. You put a high price on yourself and they rate you at that price. Suppose I set up in Harley Street tomorrow, and made it all nice and easy, with hours from 10 to 3. Do you think I should get a patient? I might starve first. How would I work it? I should let it be known that I only saw patients from midnight until 2 in the morning, and that bald-headed people must pay double. That would set people talking, their curiosity would be stimulated, and in 4 months the street would be blocked all night. Eh, what? Laddie, you'd go yourself. That's my principle here. I often come in of a morning and send them all about their business, tell them I'm going off to the country for a day. I turn away £40, and it's worth 400 as an advertisement." "But I understood from the plate that the consultations were gratis." "So they are, but they have to pay for the medicine. And if a patient wishes to come out of turn he has to pay half a guinea for the privilege. There are generally about 20 every day who would rather pay than wait several hours. But mind you, Munro, don't you make any mistake about this. All this would go for nothing if you had not something slid behind. I cure them, that's the point. I take cases that others have despaired of, and I cure them right off. All the rest is only to bring them here. But once here I keep them on my merits. It would all be a flash in the pan but for that. Now, come along and see Hetty's department." We walked down the passage to the other room. It was elaborately fitted up as a dispensary, and there, with a chic little apron, Mrs. Cullingworth was busy making up pills. With her sleeves turned up and a litter of glasses and bottles all round her, she was laughing away like a child among its toys. "The best dispenser in the world," cried Cullingworth, patting her on the shoulder. "You see how I do it, Munro. I write on a label what the prescription is, and make a sign which shows how much is to be charged. The man comes along the passage and passes the label through the pigeonhole. Hetty makes it up, passes out the bottle, and takes the money. Now, come on and clear some of these folk out of the house." It is impossible for me to give you any idea of that long line of patients, filing hour after hour through the unfurnished rooms, and departing, some amused and some frightened, with their labels in their hands. Cullingworth's antics are beyond belief. I laughed until I thought the wooden chair under me would have come to pieces. He roared, he raved, he swore, he pushed them about, slapped them on the back, shoved them against the wall, and occasionally rushed out to the head of the stair to address them en masse. At the same time, behind all this tomfoolery, I, watching his prescriptions, could see a quickness of diagnosis, a scientific insight, and a daring and unconventional use of drugs, which satisfied me that he was right in saying that, under all this charlatanism, there lay solid reasons for his success. Indeed, charlatanism is a misapplied word in this connection, for it would describe the doctor who puts on an artificial and conventional manner with his patients, rather than the one who is absolutely frank and true to his own extraordinary nature. To some of his patients he neither said one word, nor did he allow them to say one. With a loud hush he would rush at them, thump them on the chests, listen to their hearts, write their labels, and then run them out of the room by their shoulders. One poor old lady he greeted with a perfect scream. "You've been drinking too much tea," he cried. "You are suffering from tea poisoning." Then, without allowing her to get a word in, he clutched her by her crackling black mantle, dragged her up to the table, and held out a copy of Taylor's Medical Jurisprudence, which was lying there. "Put your hand on the book," he thundered, "and swear that for 14 days you will drink nothing but cocoa." She swore this with upturned eyes, and was instantly whirled off with her label in her hand, to the dispensary. I could imagine that to the last day of her life the old lady would talk of her interview with Cullingworth, and I could well understand how the village from which she came would send fresh recruits to block up his waiting rooms. Another portly person was seized by the 2 armholes of his waistcoat just as he was opening his mouth to explain his symptoms, and was rushed backward down the passage, down the stairs, and finally into the street, to the immense delight of the assembled patients. "You eat too much, drink too much, and sleep too much," Cullingworth roared after him. "Knock down a policeman, and come again when they let you out." Another patient complained of a sinking feeling. "My dear," said he, "take your medicine, and if that does no good, swallow the cork, for there is nothing better when you are sinking." As far as I could judge, the bulk of the patients looked upon a morning at Cullingworth's as a most enthralling public entertainment, tempered only by a thrill lest it should be their turn next to be made an exhibition of. Well, with half an hour for lunch, this extraordinary business went on till 3:45 in the afternoon. When the last patient had departed, Cullingworth led the way into the dispensary, where all the fees had been arranged upon the counter in the order of their value. There were 17 half-sovereigns, 73 shillings, and 46 florins, or £32, 8 and 6 in all. Cullingworth counted it up, then mixing the gold and silver into one heap, he sat running his fingers through it and playing with it. Finally he raked it into the canvas bag which I had seen the night before, and lashed the neck up with a bootlace. We walked home, and that walk struck me as the most extraordinary part of all that extraordinary day. Cullingworth paraded slowly through the principal streets with his canvas bag full of money, outstretched at the full length of his arm. His wife and I walked on either side, like 2 acolytes supporting a priest. And so we made our way solemnly homewards, the people stopping to see us pass. "I always make a point of walking through the doctor's quarter," said Cullingworth. "We are passing through it now. They all come to their windows and gnash their teeth and dance until I am out of sight." "Why should you quarrel with them? What is the matter with them?" I asked. "Pooh! What's the use of being mealy-mouthed about it?" said he. "We are all trying to cut each other's throats. And why should we be hypocritical over it? They haven't got a good word for me, any one of them. So I like to take a rise out of them. I must say that I can see no sense in it. They are your brothers in the profession, with the same education and the same knowledge. Why should you take an offensive attitude towards them?" "That's what I say, Dr. Munro," cried his wife. "It is so very unpleasant to feel that one is surrounded by enemies on every side." "Hetty's riled because their wives wouldn't call upon her," he said. "Look at that, my dear," jingling his bag. "That is better than having a lot of brainless women drinking tea and cackling in our drawing-room. I've had a big card printed, Munro, saying that we don't desire to increase the circle of our acquaintance. The maid has orders to show it to every suspicious person who calls." "Why should you not make money at your practice, and yet remain on good terms with your professional brethren?" said I. "You speak as if the 2 things were incompatible." "So they are. What's the good of beating about the bush, laddie? My methods are all unprofessional, and I break every law of medical etiquette as often as I can think of it. You know very well that the British Medical Association would hold up their hands in horror if they could see what you have seen today." "But why not conform to professional etiquette?" "Because I know better. My boy, I'm a doctor's son, and I've seen too much of it. I was born inside the machine, and I've seen all the wires. All this etiquette is a dodge for keeping the business in the hands of the older men. It's to hold the young men back, and to stop the holes by which they might slip through to the front. I've heard my father say so a score of times. He had the largest practice in Scotland, and yet he was absolutely devoid of brains. He slipped into it through seniority and decorum. No pushing, but take your turn. Very well, laddie, when you're at the top of the line. But how about it when you've just taken your place at the tail? When I'm on the top rung, I shall look down and say, "Now, you youngsters, we are going to have very strict etiquette, and I beg that you will come up very quietly and not disarrange me from my comfortable position." At the same time, if they do what I tell them, I shall look upon them as a lot of infernal blockheads. Eh, Munro, what? I could only say again that I thought he took a very low view of the profession, and that I disagreed with every word he said. Well, my boy, you may disagree as much as you like, but if you are going to work with me, you must throw etiquette to the devil. I can't do that. Well, if you are too clean-handed for the job, you can clear out. We can't keep you here against your will. I said nothing, but when we got back I went upstairs and packed up my trunk, with every intention of going back to Yorkshire by the night train. He came up to my room, and, finding what I was at, he burst into apologies which would have satisfied a more exacting man than I am. "You shall do just exactly what you like, my dear chap. If you don't like my way, you may try some way of your own." "That's fair enough," said I. "But it's a little trying to a man's self-respect if he is told to clear out every time there's a difference of opinion." "Well, well, there was no harm meant, and it shan't occur again. I can't possibly say more than that, so come along down and have a cup of tea." And so the matter blew over. But I very much fear, Bertie, that this is the first row of a series. I have a presentiment that sooner or later my position here will become untenable. Still, I shall give it a fair trial as long as he will let me. Collingworth is a fellow who likes to have nothing but inferiors and dependents round him. Now, I like to stand on my own legs and think with my own mind. If he'll let me do this, we'll get along very well. But if I know the man, he will claim submission, which is more than I am inclined to give. He has a right to my gratitude, which I freely admit. He has found an opening for me when I badly needed one and had no immediate prospects. But still, one may pay too high a price even for that, and I should feel that I was doing so if I had to give up my individuality and my manhood. We had an incident that evening which was so characteristic that I must tell you of it. Collingworth has an air gun which fires little steel darts. With this he makes excellent practice at about 20 feet, the length of the back room. We were shooting at a mark after dinner, when he asked me whether I would hold a halfpenny between my finger and thumb, and allow him to shoot it out. A halfpenny not being forthcoming, he took a bronze medal out of his waistcoat pocket, and I held that tip as a mark. Cling went the air gun, and the medal rolled upon the floor. "Plumb in the centre," said he. "On the contrary," I answered, "you never hit it at all." "Never hit it? I must have hit it." "I am confident you didn't." "Where's the dart, then?" "Here," I said, holding up a bleeding finger, from which the tail end of the fluff with which the dart was winged was protruding. I never saw a man so abjectly sorry for anything in my life. He used language of self-reproach which would have been extravagant if he had shot off one of my limbs. Our positions were absurdly reversed, and it was he who sat collapsed in a chair, while it was I, with the dart still in my finger, who leaned over him and laughed the matter off. Mrs. Collingworth had run for hot water, and presently, with the tweezers, we got the intruder out. There was very little pain, more today than yesterday, but if ever you are called upon to identify my body, you may look for a star at the end of my right forefinger. When the surgery was completed, Collingworth writhing and groaning all the time, my eyes happened to catch the medal which I had dropped lying upon the carpet. I lifted it up and looked at it, eager to find some topic which would be more agreeable. Printed upon it was, "Presented to James Collingworth for gallantry in saving life, January 1879. "Hullo, Collingworth," said I. "You never told me about this." He was off in an instant in his most extravagant style. "What, the medal? Haven't you got one? I thought everyone had." "You prefer to be select, I suppose." "It was a little boy. You've no idea the trouble I had to get him in." "Get him out, you mean?" "My dear chap, don't you understand? Anyone could get a child out. It's getting one in that's the bother. One deserves a medal for it. Then there are the witnesses, 4 shillings a day I had to pay them, and a quart of beer in the evenings. You see, you can't pick up a child and carry it to the edge of a pier and throw it in. You'd have all sorts of complications with the parents. You must be patient and wait until you get a legitimate chance. I caught a Quincy walking up and down Avonmouth Pier before I saw my opportunity. He was rather a stolid fat boy, and he was sitting on the very edge fishing. I got the sole of my foot onto the small of his back, and shot him an incredible distance. I had some little difficulty in getting him out, for his fishing line got twice round my legs, but it all ended well, and the witnesses were as staunch as possible. The boy came up to thank me the next day, and said that he was quite uninjured, save for a bruise on the back. His parents always send me a brace of fowls every Christmas. I was sitting with my finger in the hot water listening to this rigmarole. When he had finished, he ran off to get his tobacco box, and we could hear the bellowing of his laughter dwindling up the stair. I was still looking at the metal, which, from the dents all over it, had evidently been often used as a target, when I felt a timid touch upon my sleeve. It was Mrs. Collingworth, who was looking earnestly at me with a very distressed expression upon her face. "You believe far too much what James says," said she. "You don't know him in the least, Mr. Munro. You don't look at a thing from his point of view, and you will never understand him until you do. It is not, of course, that he means to say anything that is untrue, but his fancy is excited, and he is quite carried away by the humor of any idea, whether it tells against himself or not. It hurts me, Mr. Munro, to see the only man in the world towards whom he has any feeling of friendship misunderstanding him so completely, for very often when you say nothing your face shows very clearly what you think." I could only answer lamely that I was very sorry if I had misjudged her husband in any way, and that no one had a keener appreciation of some of his qualities than I had. "I saw how gravely you looked when he told you that absurd story about pushing a little boy into the water," she continued, and as she spoke, she drew from somewhere in the front of her dress a much creased slip of paper. "Just glance at that, please, Dr. Munro." It was a newspaper cutting, which gave the true account of the incident. Suffice it that it was an ice accident, and that Collingworth had really behaved in a heroic way, and had been drawn out himself insensible, with the child so clasped in his arms that it was not until he had recovered his senses that they were able to separate them. I had hardly finished reading it when we heard his steps on the stairs, and she, thrusting the paper back into her bosom, became in an instant the same silently watchful woman as ever. Is he not a conundrum? If he interests you at a distance, and I take for granted that what you say in your letters is not merely conventional compliment, you can think how piquant he is in actual life. I must confess, however, that I can never shake off the feeling that I am living with some capricious creature who frequently growls and may possibly bite. Well, it won't be very long before I write again, and by that time I shall probably know whether I am likely to find any permanent billet here or not. I am so sorry to hear about Mrs. Swanborough's indisposition. You know that I take the deepest interest in everything that affects you. They tell me here that I am looking very fit, though I think they ought to spell it with an A. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Truman Thames. The Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 8. The Parade. Bradfield, 6th of April, 1882. I am writing this, my dear Bertie, at a little table which has been fitted up in the window of my bedroom. Everyone in the house is asleep except myself, and all the noise of the city is hushed, yet my own brain is singularly active, and I feel that I am better employed in sitting up and writing to you than in tossing about upon my bed. I am often accused of being sleepy in the daytime, but every now and then nature gets level by making me abnormally wakeful at night. Are you conscious of the restful influence which the stars exert? To me, they are the most soothing things in nature. I am proud to say that I don't know the name of one of them. The glamour and romance would pass away from them if they were all classified and ticketed in one's brain. But when a man is hot and flurried, and full of his own little ruffled dignities and infinitesimal misfortunes, then a star bath is the finest thing in the world. They are so big, and so serene, and so lovely. They tell me that the interplanetary spaces are full of the debris of shattered asteroids, so, perhaps even among them, there are such things as disease and death. Yet just to look at them must remind a man of what a bacillus of a thing he is. The whole human race like some sprinkling of impalpable powder upon the surface of one of the most insignificant flywheels of a monstrous machine. But there's order in it, Bertie, there's order. And where there is order, there must be mind. And where there is mind, there must be sense of justice. I don't allow that there can be any doubt as to the existence of that central mind, or as to the possession by it of certain attributes. The stars help me to realize these. It is strange, when one looks upon them, to think that the churches are still squabbling down here over such questions as whether the Almighty is gratified by our emptying a teaspoonful of water over our babies' heads, or by our waiting a few years and then plunging them bodily into a tank. It would be comic if it were not so tragic. This train of thought is the afterswell from an argument with Cullingworth this evening. He holds that the human race is deteriorating mentally and morally. He calls out at the grossness which confounds the Creator with a young Jewish philosopher. I tried to show him that this is no proof of degeneration, since the Jewish philosopher at least represented a moral idea, and was therefore on an infinitely higher plane than the sensual divinities of the ancients. His own views of the Creator seem to me to be a more evident degeneration. He declares that looking round at nature, he can see nothing but ruthlessness and brutality. Either the Creator is not all-powerful, or else he is not all good, says he. Either he can stop these atrocities and won't, in which case he is not all good, or else he would stop them but can't, in which case he is not all-powerful. It was a difficult dilemma for a man who professes to stick to reason to get out of. Of course, if you plead faith, you can always slip out of anything. I was forced to get behind a corner of that buckler with which you have so often turned my own thrusts. I said that the dilemma arose from our taking it for granted that that which seemed evil really was evil. "It lies with you to prove that it isn't," said he. "We may hope that it isn't," said I. "Wait until someone tells you that you have cancer of the pyloric end of the stomach," said he, and he shouted it out again every time I tried to renew the argument. But, in all soberness, I really do think, Bertie, that very much which seems to be saddest in life might be very different if we could focus it properly. I tried to give you my ideas about this in the case of drink and immorality, but physically I fancy that it applies more obviously than it does morally. All the physical evils of life seem to culminate in death, and yet death, as I have seen it, has not been a painful or terrible process. In many cases a man dies without having incurred nearly as much pain during the whole of his fatal illness as would have arisen from a whitlow or an abscess of the jaw. It is often those deaths which seem most terrible to the onlooker which are least so to the sufferer. When a man is overtaken by an express and shivered into fragments, or when he drops from a fourth-floor window and is smashed into a bag of splinters, the unfortunate spectators are convulsed with horror, and find a text for pessimistic views about the providence which allows such things to be. And yet it is very doubtful whether the deceased, could his tongue be loosened, would remember anything at all about the matter. We know as students of medicine that though pain is usually associated with cancers and with abdominal complaints, still, in the various fevers, in apoplexy, in blood poisonings, in lung diseases, and, in short, in the greater proportion of serious maladies, there is little suffering. I remember how struck I was when first I saw the actual cautery applied in a case of spinal disease. The white-hot iron was pressed firmly into the patient's back, without the use of any anesthetic, and what with the sight and the nauseating smell of burned flesh, I felt faint and ill. Yet, to my astonishment, the patient never flinched nor moved a muscle of his face, and on my inquiring afterwards, he assured me that the proceeding was absolutely painless, a remark which was corroborated by the surgeon. "The nerves are so completely and instantaneously destroyed," he explained, "that they have no time to convey a painful impression." But then, if this be so, what becomes of all the martyrs at the stake, and the victims of Red Indians, and other poor folk over whose sufferings and constancy we have wondered? It may be that Providence is not only not cruel itself, but will not allow man to be cruel either. Do your worst, and it will step in with a "No, I won't allow this poor child of mine to be hurt." And then comes the dulling of the nerve, and the lethargy which takes the victim out of the reach of the tormentor. David Livingstone, under the claws of the lion, must have looked like an object lesson of the evil side of things, and yet he has left it upon record that his own sensations were pleasurable rather than otherwise. I am well convinced that if the newly born infant and the man who had just died could compare their experiences, the former would have proved to be the sufferer. It is not for nothing that the first thing the newcomer into this planet does is to open its toothless mouth and protest energetically against fate. Cullingworth has written a parable which makes a paragraph for our wonderful new weekly paper. "The little cheese mites held debate," he says, "as to who made the cheese. Some thought that they had no data to go upon, and some that it had come together by a solidification of vapour, or by the centrifugal attraction of atoms. A few surmised that the platter might have something to do with it, but the wisest of them could not deduce the existence of a cow." We are at one, he and I, in thinking that the infinite is beyond our perception. We differ only in that he sees evil, and I see good, in the working of the universe. Ah, what a mystery it all is! Let us be honest and humble, and think kindly of each other. There's a line of stars all winking at me over the opposite roof, winking slyly at the silly little person with the pen and paper who is so earnest about what he can never understand. Well, I'll come back to something practical. It is nearly a month since I wrote you last. The date is impressed upon my memory because it was the day after Cullingworth shot the air dart into my finger. The place festered and prevented my writing to anyone for a week or two, but it is all right again now. I have ever so much of different sorts to tell you, but really, when I come to think of it, it does not amount to very much after all. First of all, about the practice. I told you that I was to have a room immediately opposite to Cullingworth's, and that all the surgical cases were to be turned over to me. For a few days I had nothing to do, except to listen to him romping and scuffling with his patients, or making speeches to them from the top of the stairs. However, a great Dr. Stock Munro, surgeon, had been affixed to the side of the door downstairs, opposite Cullingworth's plate, and a proud man was I when first my eyes lit upon it. On the fourth day, however, in came a case. He little knew that he was the first that I had ever had all to myself in my life. Perhaps he would not have looked quite so cheerful if he had realized it. Poor chap, he had little enough to be cheery over either. He was an old soldier who had lost a good many teeth, but who had continued to find room between his nose and chin for a short black clay pipe. Lately there appeared a small sore on his nose, which had spread and become crusted. On feeling it, I found it as hard as a streak of glue, with constant darting pains passing through it. Of course, there could be no question as to diagnosis. It was epitheliomatous cancer, caused by the irritation of the hot tobacco smoke. I sent him back to his village, and 2 days after I drove over in Cullingworth's dog-cart, and removed the growth. I only got a sovereign for it, but it may be a nucleus for cases. The old fellow did most admirably, and he has just been in, with the most aristocratic curl to his nostrils, to tell me that he has bought a box full of churchwardens. It was my first operation, and I dare say I was more nervous about it than my patient, but the result has given me confidence. I have fully made up my mind to let nothing pass me. Come what may, I am prepared to do it. Why should a man wait? Of course, I know that many men do, but surely one's nerve is more likely to be strong, and one's knowledge fresh now than in 20 years. Cases came dribbling in from day to day, all very poor people, and able to pay very poor fees, but still most welcome to me. The first week I took, including that operation fee, £1.17 and 6p. The second, I got £2 exactly. The third, I had £2.05, and now I find that this last week has brought in £2.18, so I am moving in the right direction. Of course, it compares absurdly enough with Cullingworth's £20 a day, and my little quiet backwater seems a strange contrast to the noisy stream which pours for ever through his room. Still, I am quite satisfied, and I have no doubt at all that his original estimate of £300 for the first year will be amply justified. It would be a pleasant thing to think that if anything were really to happen at home, I should be able to be of some use to them. If things go on as they have become, I shall soon have my feet firmly planted. I was compelled, by the way, to forego an opening which a few months ago would have been the very summit of my ambition. You must know, possibly I told you, that immediately after I passed, I put my name down as a candidate for a surgeonship on the books of several of the big steamship lines. It was done as a forlorn hope, for a man has usually to wait several years before his turn comes around. Well, just a week after I started here, I got a telegram one night from Liverpool. Join the Decia tomorrow as surgeon, not later than 8 in the evening. It was from Staunton and Merivale, the famous South American firm, and the Decia is a fine 6,000-ton passenger boat, doing the round journey by Bahia and Buenos Aires to Rio and Valparaiso. I had a bad quarter of an hour, I can tell you. I don't think I was ever so undecided about anything in my life. Cullingworth was dead against my going, and his influence carried the day. "My dear chap," said he, "you'd knock down the chief mate, and he'd spread you out with a handspike. You'd get tied by your thumbs to the rigging. You'd be fed on stinking water and putrid biscuits. I've been reading a novel about the merchant service, and I know." When I laughed at his ideas of modern sea-going, he tried another line. "You're a bigger fool than I take you for if you go," said he. "Why, what can it lead to? All the money you earn goes to buy a blue coat and daub it with lace. You think you're bound for Valparaiso, and you find yourself at the poorhouse. You've got a rare opening here, and everything ready to your hand. You'll never get such another again. And so it ended by my letting them have a wire to say that I could not come. It is strange when you come to a point where the road of your life obviously divides, and you take one turning or the other after vainly trying to be sure about the finger-post. I think, after all, I chose rightly. A ship's surgeon must remain a ship's surgeon, while here there is no horizon to my possibilities. As to old Cullingworth, he is booming along as merrily as ever. You say in your last that what you cannot understand is how he got his hold of the public in so short a time. That is just the point which I have found it hard to get light upon. He told me that after his first coming he had not a patient for a month, and that he was so disheartened that he very nearly made a moonlight exodus. At last, however, a few cases came his way, and he made such extraordinary cures of them, or else impressed them so by his eccentricity, that they would do nothing but talk of him. Some of his wonderful results got into the local press, though after my Avonmouth experience I should not like to guarantee that he did not himself convey them there. He showed me an almanac, which had a great circulation in the district. It had an entry sandwiched in this way: August 15th, Reform Bill passed, 1867. August 16th, birth of Julius Caesar. August 17th, extraordinary cure by Dr. Cullingworth of a case of dropsy in Bradfield, 1881. August 18th, Battle of Gravelotte, 1870. It reads as if it were one of the landmarks of the latter half of the century. I asked him how on earth it got there, but I could only learn that the woman was 56 inches round the waist, and that he had treated her with elaterium. That leads me to another point. You ask me whether his cures are really remarkable, and, if so, what his system is. I answer unhesitatingly that his cures are very remarkable indeed, and that I look upon him as a sort of Napoleon of medicine. His view is that the pharmacopoeial doses are in nearly every instance much too low. Excessive timidity has cut down the dose until it has ceased to produce a real effect upon the disease. Medical men, according to his view, have been afraid of producing a poisonous effect with their drugs. With him, on the contrary, the whole art of medicine lies in judicious poisoning, and when the case is serious, his remedies are heroic. Where in epilepsy I should have given 30 grain doses of bromide or chloral every 4 hours, he would give 2 drachms every 3. No doubt it would seem to you very kill or cure, and I am myself afraid that a succession of coroner's inquests may check Cullingworth's career. But hitherto he has had no public scandal, while the cases he has brought back to life have been numerous. He is the most fearless fellow. I have seen him pour opium into a dysenteric patient until my hair bristled, but either his knowledge or his luck always brings him out right. Then there are other cures which depend, I think, upon his own personal magnetism. He is so robust and loud-voiced and hearty that a weak, nervous patient goes away from him recharged with vitality. He is so perfectly confident that he can cure them that he makes them perfectly confident that they can be cured, and you know how in nervous cases the mind reacts upon the body. If he chose to preserve crutches and sticks, as they do in the medieval churches, he might, I am sure, paper his consulting room with them. A favourite device of his with an impressionable patient is to name the exact hour of their cure. "My dear," he will say, swaying some girl about by the shoulders, with his nose about 3 inches from hers, "you'll feel better tomorrow at 9:45, and at 20 past you'll be as well as you ever were in your life. Now keep your eye on the clock, and see if I am not right." Next day, as likely as not, her mother will be in, weeping tears of joy, and another miracle has been added to Cullingworth's record. It may smell of quackery, but it is exceedingly useful to the patient. Still, I must confess that there is nothing about Cullingworth which jars me so much as the low view which he takes of our profession. I can never reconcile myself to his ideas, and yet I can never convert him to mine, so there will be a chasm there, which sooner or later may open to divide us altogether. He will not acknowledge any philanthropic side to the question. A profession, in his view, is a means of earning a livelihood, and the doing good to our fellow mortals is quite a secondary one. "Why the devil should we do all the good, Munro?" he shouts. What? A butcher would do good to the race, would he not, if he served his chops out gratis through the window? He'd be a real benefactor, but he goes on selling them at 1 shilling the pound for all that. Take the case of a doctor who devotes himself to sanitary science. He flushes out drains and keeps down infection. You call him a philanthropist. Well, I call him a traitor. That's it, Munro, a traitor and a renegade. Did you ever hear of a Congress of lawyers for simplifying the law and discouraging litigation? What are the Medical Association and the General Council and all these bodies for, laddie? For encouraging the best interests of the profession. Do you suppose they do that by making the population healthy? It's about time we had a mutiny among the general practitioners. If I had the use of half the funds which the association has, I should spend part of them in drain blocking, and the rest in the cultivation of disease germs and the contamination of drinking water. Of course, I told him that his views were diabolical, but, especially since that warning which I had from his wife, I discount everything that he says. He begins in earnest, but as he goes on, the humor of exaggeration gets hold of him, and he winds up with things which he would never uphold in cold blood. However, the fact remains that we differ widely in our views of professional life, and I fear that we may come to grief over the question. What do you think we have been doing lately? Building a stable, no less. Cullingworth wanted to have another one at the business place, as much, I think, for his patients as his horses, and in his audacious way he determined that he would build it himself. So at it we went, he, I, the coachman, Mrs. Cullingworth, and the coachman's wife. We dug foundations, got bricks in by the cartload, made our own mortar, and I think that we shall end by making a very fair job of it. It's not quite as flat-chested as we could wish, and I think that if I were a horse inside it, I should be careful about brushing against the walls, but still, it will keep the wind and rain out when it is finished. Cullingworth talks of our building a new house for ourselves, but as we have 3 large ones already, there does not seem to be any pressing need. Talking about horses, we had no end of a fuss here the other day. Cullingworth got it into his head that he wanted a first-class riding horse, and as neither of the carriage ones would satisfy him, he commissioned a horse dealer to get him one. The man told us of a charger which one of the officers in the garrison was trying to get rid of. He did not conceal the fact that the reason why he wished to sell it was because he considered it to be dangerous. But he added that Captain Lucas had given £150 for it and was prepared to sell it at 70. This excited Cullingworth, and he ordered the creature to be saddled and brought round. It was a beautiful animal, coal-black, with a magnificent neck and shoulders, but with a nasty backward tilt to its ears, and an unpleasant way of looking at you. The horse-dealer said that our yard was too small to try the creature in, but Cullingworth clambered up upon its back, and formally took possession of it by lamming it between the ears with the bone handle of his whip. Then ensued one of the most lively 10 minutes that I can remember. The beast justified his reputation, but Cullingworth, although he was no horseman, stuck to him like a limpet. Backwards, forwards, sideways, on his forefeet, on his hind feet, with his back curved, with his back sunk, bucking and kicking, there was nothing the creature did not try. Cullingworth was sitting alternately on his mane and on the root of his tail, never, by any chance, in the saddle. He had lost both stirrups, and his knees were drawn up and his heels dug into the creature's ribs, while his hands clawed at mane, saddle, or ears, whichever he saw in front of him. He kept his whip, however, and whenever the brute eased down, Cullingworth lammed him once more with the bone handle. His idea, I suppose, was to break its spirit, but he had taken a larger contract than he could carry through. The animal bunched his 4 feet together, ducked down his head, arched his back like a yawning cat, and gave 3 convulsive springs into the air. At the first, Cullingworth's knees were above the saddle flaps. At the second, his ankles were retaining a convulsive grip. At the third, he flew forward like a stone out of a sling, and narrowly missing the coping of the wall, broke with his head the iron bar which held some wire netting, and toppled back with a thud into the yard. Up he bounded, with the blood streaming down his face, and running into our half-finished stables, he seized a hatchet, and with a bellow of rage rushed at the horse. I caught him by the coat and put on a 14-stone drag, while the horse-dealer, who was as white as a cheese, ran off with his horse into the street. Cullingworth broke away from my grip, and cursing incoherently, his face slobbered with blood, and his hatchet waving over his head, he rushed out of the yard, the most diabolical-looking ruffian you can imagine. However, luckily for the dealer, he had got a good start, and Cullingworth was persuaded to come back and wash his face. We bound up his cut, and found him little the worse, except in temper. But for me, he would most certainly have paid £70 for his insane outburst of rage against the animal. I dare say you think it strange that I should write so much about this fellow, and so little about anybody else. But the fact is that I know nobody else, and that my whole circle is bounded by my patients, Cullingworth and his wife. They visit nobody, and nobody visits them. My living with them brings the same taboo from my brother doctors upon my head, although I have never done anything unprofessional myself. Who should I see in the street the other day but the McFarlanes, whom you will remember at Linlithgow? I was foolish enough to propose to Mamie McFarlane once, and she was sensible enough to refuse me. What I should have done had she accepted me, I can't imagine, for that was 3 years ago, and I have more ties and less prospect of marriage now than then. Well, there's no use in yearning for what you can't have, and there's no other man living to whom I would speak about the matter at all. But life is a deadly lonely thing when a man has no one on his side but himself. Why is it that I am sitting here in the moonlight writing to you, except that I am craving for sympathy and fellowship? I get it from you, too, as much as one friend ever got from another. And yet there are some sides to my nature with which neither wife nor friend nor anyone else can share. If you cut your own path, you must expect to find yourself alone upon it. Hey-ho! It's nearly dawn, and I as wakeful as ever. It is chilly, and I have draped a blanket round me. I've heard that this is the favourite hour of the suicide, and I see that I've been tailing off in the direction of melancholy myself. Let me wind up on a lighter chord by quoting Cullingworth's latest article. I must tell you that he is still inflamed by the idea of his own paper, and his brain is in full eruption, sending out a perpetual stream of libellous paragraphs, doggerel poems, social skits, parodies, and articles. He brings them all to me, and my table is already piled with them. Here is his latest, brought up to my room after he had undressed. It was the outcome of some remarks I had made about the difficulty which our far-off descendants may have in determining what the meaning is of some of the commonest objects of our civilization, and as a corollary, how careful we should be before we become dogmatic about the old Romans or Egyptians. At the third annual meeting of the New Guinea Archaeological Society, a paper was read upon recent researches on the supposed site of London, together with some observations upon hollow cylinders in use among the ancient Londoners. Several examples of these metallic cylinders or tubings were on exhibition in the hall, and were passed round for inspection among the audience. The learned lecturer prefaced his remarks by observing that on the account of the enormous interval of time which separated them from the days when London was a flourishing city, it behoved them to be very guarded in any conclusions to which they might come as to the habits of the inhabitants. Recent research appeared to have satisfactorily established the fact that the date of the final fall of London was somewhat later than that of the erection of the Egyptian pyramids. A large building had recently been unearthed near the dried-up bed of the River Thames, and there could be no question from existing records that this was the seat of the law-making council among the ancient Britons, or Anglicans, as they were sometimes called. The lecturer proceeded to point out that the bed of the Thames had been tunnelled under by a monarch named Brunel, who is supposed by some authorities to have succeeded Alfred the Great. The open spaces of London, he went on to remark, must have been far from safe, as the bones of lions, tigers, and other extinct forms of carnivora had been discovered at the Regent's Park. Having briefly referred to the mysterious structures known as pillar boxes, which are scattered thickly over the city, and which are either religious in their origin, or else may be taken as marking the tombs of Anglican chiefs, the lecturer passed on to the cylindrical piping. This had been explained by the Patagonian school as being a universal system of lightning conductors. He, the lecturer, could not assent to this theory. In a series of observations, extending over several months, he had discovered the important fact that these hollow lines of tubing, if followed out, invariably led to large hollow metallic reservoirs which were connected with furnaces. No one who knew how addicted the ancient Britons were to the use of tobacco could doubt what this meant. Evidently, large quantities of the herb were burned in the central chamber, and the aromatic and narcotic vapour was carried through the tubes to the house of every citizen, so that he might inhale it at will. Having illustrated his remarks by a series of diagrams, the lecturer concluded by saying that, although true science was invariably cautious and undogmatic, it was none the less an incontestable fact that so much light had been thrown upon old London that every action of the citizen's daily life was known, from the taking of a tub in the morning until after a draught of porter he painted himself blue before retiring to rest. After all, I dare say this explanation of the London gas pipes is not more absurd than some of our shots about the pyramids, or ideas of life among the Babylonians. Well, goodbye, old chap. This is a stupid, inconsequential letter, but life has been more quiet and less interesting just of late. I may have something a little more moving for my next.
End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of the Stark Munro Letters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to see how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Truman Thames. Chapter 9 of the Stark Munro Letters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The Parade, Bradfield, April 23rd, 1882. I have some recollection, my dear Bertie, that when I wrote you a rambling, disconnected sort of letter about 3 weeks ago, I wound up by saying that I might have something more interesting to tell you next time. Well, so it has turned out. The whole game is up here, and I am off upon a fresh line of rails altogether. Cullingworth is to go one way, and I another, and yet I am glad to say that there has not been any quarrel between us. As usual, I have begun my letter at the end, but I'll work up to it more deliberately now, and let you know exactly how it came about.